The city at midnight had a different heartbeat. The rush of daytime traffic softened into a steady hum, neon signs flickered like tired fireflies. Office towers, once bristling with ambition, exhaled into quiet. In one glass and steel monolith at the edge of the financial district, fluorescent lights still burned as if the building refused to sleep. Ayla pushed the mop bucket along the 8th-floor corridor with the practiced economy of motion she'd taught herself over years of late-night shifts. The rubber wheels squeaked in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Push, glide, turn, repeat. Her uniform, soft, faded navy with a name badge kept carefully folded in her pocket, smelled faintly of lemon polish. Her hair was pinned under a scarf, a little frayed at the edges, but she had swept it into a neat bun that no one would notice unless they looked closely. Most nights she liked the stillness. It allowed her mind to travel places she couldn't afford to visit in daylight. She rehearsed the grocery list in her head, ran through the names of her cousins, hummed snatches of old songs that her mother used to sing. Tonight, however, the silence felt brittle, as if the building were holding its breath. It was the 7th floor that made her pause. There had been voices, low, urgent, leaking through the door of conference room B. Ayla was supposed to vacuum the hall and move on, but curiosity had been a stubborn companion since childhood. She set the mop aside and stood, half hidden behind a potted ficus, listening. "It has to be tonight," a man's voice said inside, clipped and calm. "Adrian signs, and the deal is closed. No more delays." Another voice, softer, threaded with something like smoothed malice. "We've structured it so that once the signature goes through, the assets will be reallocated. He'll be left with liabilities. By the time he realizes." A silence, then a laugh. "He won't realize. He never reads the fine print." Ayla's palms went cold. She knew a little about paper and signatures. Her mother had once sold a collection of old jewelry to settle a debt and had signed a paper the seller had slid across the table like a friendly invitation. 2 weeks later, the house lost its electricity and later its title. Signatures could be small thunderstorms, quiet, sudden, and devastating. She edged closer to the frosted glass that separated the hallway and the conference room. From here she couldn't see faces clearly. The glass disguised identity with streaks of bright light and shadow. But she could hear every syllable, and her ears, accustomed to listening to whispered crises in broom closets and stairwells, catalogued the words as precisely as if she were writing them down. "He trusts the board," the clipped voice said. "He'd never suspect." "Even if he suspects, the optics are perfect," the softer voice said. "We'll make it look like a consolidation. He'll be framed as benevolent, stepping down for the good of the company." Ayla's breath hitched. The man they spoke of, Adrian, was a name she had heard around the building in passing, a handsome portrait on a plaque near the executive elevators, a clean-lined signature at the bottom of press releases. She had never met him. From the rumors that floated down the stairwell, he was one of those rare millionaires who smiled in public and kept his private life tidy. People said he donated to shelters, funded school scholarships. They called him generous. They called him charming. They used the word kind like a hayload. If what the men schemed was true, he was about to be made a martyr of his own trust. Ayla's fingers tightened on the broom handle. She could walk away. It wasn't her business. No one would ever know. No one would miss a woman whose job was to make the company look presentable at night. But she had seen trust taken before, watched promises collapses like playing cards. She had been there when her mother signed away light and laughter. She had been there when her brother took the bus pass so the baby could have milk. There were debts that could be paid later. Some debts, moral debts, refused to wait. From the corner of the corridor, a shadow detached itself and melted into the stairwell. Ayla sucked in a breath. The mop bucket rolled a little as she moved, but the wheels were quiet on the carpet. She stepped to the staircase and, on instinct rather than any plan, took 2 steps down. The stairwell breathed a cooler air. The acoustics were different. Muffled words became clearer like someone turning a radio dial. She descended just far enough to place herself by a landing where the door to the executive's mezzanine sat propped slightly ajar. That was where she met him. He emerged into the landing like someone born to shine in a room and yet at once ordinary. Jeans and a navy jacket, a shirt with the top button undone as if in perpetual readiness for work and for conversation. He held a slim leather folder tucked under his arm, and his hair, the color of early dusk, was raked back with effortless care. When he looked at her, the world narrowed for a heartbeat. His eyes were a quiet kind of grey that didn't demand attention but instead suggested an invitation to tell the truth. He had a way about him that made strangers lend him the plot of their stories. There was nothing theatrical in his face, no booming laugh, no crafted pose, just the soft architecture of someone who understood people. He stopped when he noticed the door. "I thought we were done," he said to the empty conference room. Before she could decide whether to leave, he smiled, brief, not condescending. "Oh, sorry." That was to her. Ayla swallowed. Her mouth felt dry. Sir," she said, and the word felt clumsy. Nobody called him sir at the top floors, they called him Mr. Rowan, or simply Adrian. The word made the corridor sound like another country. His eyebrows rose, half in curiosity, half in a polite amusement. "Yes." She looked down at her mop as if it were an argument she could present. The outline of the conference room behind him, the low murmur that still clung to the air, the distant thud of the elevator, it all pressed at her like a tide. There were men in there," she said, "talking about a signing." Adrian's expression shifted. The careful neutrality folded into a sharper attention. He glanced back toward the door, then at the folder under his arm. "Tonight?" he asked. Ayla nodded. "They said it had to be tonight." "They said," her voice broke on the last word. She wanted to tell him everything, how they spoke of reallocation, of framing him as stepping down, of liabilities hidden like traps, but her training in invisibility held her tongue. The language of the board, assets, liabilities, consolidation, was not hers. She had no authority, no title, no proof to lay on the polished table. Yet the words had weight. They had teeth. Adrian closed his eyes for a second, the movement small, human. When he opened them, something gentled in his face, as if he loved the idea that someone had come with clean hands and a warning. Not every person would have stopped to listen to a cleaning lady. "Thank you," he said softly. "What did you hear, exactly?" She repeated the phrases as best as she could, the sentences tumbling out like beads on a string. "They said once he signs the assets will move and he'll be left with liabilities. They said they'll make it look like a consolidation. He won't read the fine print. He trusts the board." Adrian's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the leather folder. For a moment he said nothing, and the silence was full of a kind of decision she could not yet see. She had expected him to be angry, angry that she had listened, angry that she had interrupted, but his face did not harden. Instead, something quietly combustible lit behind his eyes. "You did the right thing," he said. It was a small phrase, but to her it sounded like a benediction. "Do you know who was speaking?" "No," she said. "They said the names like it's not important. It's the contract." Her hands found their way to her sleeves. "Please don't sign it." It was the most dangerous words she had ever spoken. Adrian's mouth quirked. "Most people who know me would tell you I do sign a lot of things," he said, and there was humor there, but the edges were serious. Why do you care?" Ayla looked at him, really looked, and for the first time she let herself be honest in a way she hadn't permitted in years. "Because I know what a signature can do," she said. "My mother signed once for a seller to fix our roof. He took the roof and the rest. She couldn't read the paper. She thought it was a receipt. She cried for 3 days under the moon. The light came back only when the neighbor lent us money. I don't want you to lose what you can't see." The story landed in the space between them and made them both strange and familiar. Adrian's fingers relaxed. The folder under his arm seemed suddenly heavier, an artifact of governance and of things that could be dismantled with a line of ink. "You have courage," he said. She bristled at the word, then softened. "I have laundry," she said. "Which probably gives me courage." He laughed, a short, honest sound, and it made the stairwell feel like a place for small miracles. "You're braver than you know," he said. "What's your name?" "Ayla." The word felt like a promise. "Adrian Rowan," he answered, and when he said his name, she pictured the glossy plaque and the boardroom portraits, all the stories she'd only ever seen from the other side of a cleaning cart. It made her stomach twist. "Mr. Rowan," she began, then stopped herself. The title tasted too formal. "Adrian," she corrected with a nervous smile. "You can call me Adrian," he said, as an invitation. They stood there for a few more heartbeats, Two people from different maps of the city sharing an unplanned intersection. The building hummed like a living thing around them, air cycling, the distant clack of a keyboard like someone tapping Morse code for the restless. He glanced at his watch, then at the folder again. I shouldn't sign anything without reading it, he said slowly, as if saying it aloud might bend fate. You did good to tell me. You'll be in trouble, Ayla said before she could stop herself. The words tumbled out. People talk. People will say it's not your place. Adrian met her gaze. If they call you out of place for stopping a crime, that says more about them than about you, he said. There was no show of indignation, just a warmth that neither courted forgiveness nor demanded gratitude. I want to hear the full contract before anything happens. Will you tell me if you hear more? Will you tell someone? She shook her head. The idea of telling someone official made her palms slick with fear, fear of being dismissed, fear of becoming a spectacle. No, she said. I'm not important. I clean. But I can listen. He hesitated, then did something small and startling. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim business card. He handed it to her with the sort of casual gravity that made the card feel like an anchor in her palm. If you hear anything else, he said, call this number. Or, leave a note with reception and ask them to give it to me personally. And Ayla, thank you. Her fingers curled around the card. The name on it, Adrian Rowan, Chief Executive Officer, glimmered like a star she was not used to acquainting with. Her thumb brushed the digits as if they were a lifeline. I will, she said. He turned to the conference room door as if to walk away, then paused. One more thing, he said, and when he looked back, there was a gentleness she found both unfamiliar and not entirely foreign. Don't be afraid to speak up again. People often need voices they don't expect. Ayla nodded. She should have returned to her cart and pretended the incident had not changed the axis of her night. That might have been the safe thing to do. But as Adrian moved then, a soft, human momentum followed him, hesitant, curious. He didn't slam the door on her world. He had offered her a small kindness and, with it, an unwitting invitation to be seen. When she resumed her path down the hall with the mop and bucket, the corridor looked the same but felt like a different city. The tiles glinted under the night lights as if they had been stirred by a new current. Her feet moved in their practice pattern, but her mind replayed every syllable she had heard, every line of the men's plan. The words were now a live wire somewhere between the filing cabinets and the boardroom table. Back at the elevator, she watched Adrian's silhouette through the glass as he stepped inside. The elevator doors closed with a soft whisper, and he was gone upward into the space of his life, one made of decisions and signatures and the kind of influence she had only ever glimpsed from the outside. Ayla tucked the business card into her pocket over her folded name badge. The paper pressed against her fingers like a secret. She felt the tug of two currents, the urge to remain invisible, to be the woman the world sees only when it needs a clean floor, and the impulse that had always lived under her ribs, the stubborn, dangerous thing that said do not look away. She returned to the corridor, to the mop, to the rhythm. The meeting had been brief, the city would not turn for one conversation. But sometimes a single voice was enough to set a different course. As she worked, she kept hearing the men's voices, he won't suspect. They sounded suddenly mortal, vulnerable to a laundrywoman's courage and the single, stubborn truth that not all debts could be measured in dollars. The night stretched ahead, and somewhere on the 17th floor a contract waited for a pen. Ayla imagined the pen poised above paper, the ink ready to make permanence of the wrong thing. She pictured it like a drop of black paint on white fabric, an accident that could never be erased. She ran her hand along the spine of the mop handle until the cold of the metal warmed. The decision to warn him, to step into a corridor that was not hers, felt dangerous and right at the same time, like reaching for a hand in a storm. And in her pocket, the business card pressed a quiet weight against her palm, a reminder that sometimes the smallest hands can move the heaviest levers. The next morning the building resumed its daytime rhythm as if it had nothing to do with the night's small rebellion. The atrium flooded with sunlight, coffee steam rose in white curls, and men and women in crisp suits threaded the lobby with the urgent purpose of the day. Ayla arrived with her mop bucket and the same careful stoicism she had practiced for years, but something in the air felt altered, not loudly, but as if a clock had been nudged forward by a minute and the hands would catch up sooner or later. She kept the business card folded against her chest beneath her uniform. It was a talisman that made her palms sweat when she thought of it. The memory of Adrian's grey eyes, soft and level, returned like a tune she could not shake. The men in the conference room had been methodical, their language was precise and dry. Conspiracy lived in clauses and footnotes, and Ayla's nights had taught her that the smallest clause could start a landslide. As the elevators spilled a steady parade of commuters, she pushed her cart down the corridor toward conference room B. The scent of lemon cleaner and office coffee mixed into a strangely domestic perfume. The doorknob to the conference room was cool beneath her hand. She paused, listening. Voices, husky, decisive, drifted out as if the room held a secret it wanted to make ordinary. Ayla straightened her back and stepped inside. "And that's why we proceed at noon," a voice was saying, the softer voice she had heard before, but now it wore a veneer of corporate patience. "Publicly, it's consolidation. Internally, the reallocation will be final once he signs." A man in a charcoal suit looked up from a spread of papers and smiled with practiced politeness when he noticed her. It was the kind of smile that measured people by their utility. Ayla's fingers tightened on the handle of her broom. "I'm just here to clean," she said. The words were small in the cavern of the room. The men glanced between themselves, then back at her. One of them, younger, with a narrow face, said, "This isn't open to staff." Ayla met his gaze. Something in her would not lower. "It concerns him," she said. "It concerns Mr. Rowan. Please don't sign anything tonight." The humor in the room cut thin like glass. "You don't understand corporate timelines," the narrow-faced man said. "This is strategic." Ayla's voice did not tremble. Strategy shouldn't mean theft. At the corner table, a woman, polished and exact, her nails a glossy neutral, set down a pen and regarded Ayla with a flicker of irritation. "Who put you up to this?" she asked. "Do you want a reprimand? We can always have security escort." "No one put me up," Ayla said. "I heard you last night. I told Mr. Rowan." The room went colder in that instant, and Ayla felt the weight of all the eyes fall on her like a test. The polished woman rose, and the men straightened their ties. "Is Mr. Rowan aware of this?" she asked with a tone that suggested the answer should be a confession. "He is," Ayla said. "He asked me to tell him if I hear anything else." "That's not how this works," another man said. "Mr. Rowan is not," he stopped himself. "We'll handle it." "Handle it how?" Ayla persisted. "By letting him sign? By letting him think it's his decision while you strip him of everything? If you want him to schedule a benevolent exit, do it without framing him as a fool." There was a hardness to the way she said the words that seemed to surprise even her. She had not rehearsed passion, she had only learned to be honest when truth was needed. The polished woman's mouth thinned. "You're making an accusation," the woman said. "That's serious." Ayla looked at the spread of contracts on the table, thick, clean pages with embossed company heads and legal jargon dancing like a foreign alphabet. "I'm making an observation," she said. "And I'm warning you, because if you hurt him, you will hurt a lot of people who trust him for reasons you don't understand." The polished woman's lips curled. "You speak as if you know him." "I do know him," Ayla said. "Not the man in the papers. The way people say kind and act like it's nothing. I heard someone say he was generous when I was sweeping. That matters. It matters more than whatever you'll gain." Silence held the conference room like a held breath. The men's eyes narrowed in the slow math of damage control. The narrow-faced man made a small, staged effort at a smile. "You have heart," he said, patronizing. "But this isn't a charity. It's business." Ayla could have walked away then. The safe thing, again, was to vanish into the corridors. But something in her, the memory of a mother who had misplaced a signature and a roof and a winter's warmth, would not let her stay invisible. "You think you can take advantage of kindness," she said. "Be careful. Kindness is not weakness. It's the first thing you should be afraid of." A laugh, brittle and controlled, echoed from the far side of the table. "You speak poetry for a cleaner," one of the men said. That was when the door opened and Adrian walked in. He did not stride in like a storm, he came in with a steadiness that commanded the room without noise. The papers on the table seemed to humble themselves in his presence. He set his leather folder down, and the light caught the crease along the spine like a mark of custody. The polished woman's jaw tightened. The men sat a hair straighter. "Good morning," Adrian said. He looked at Ayla, and the room felt as if someone had rearranged the air. "What are we discussing?" There was a ripple, not of fear, exactly, but a recalibration. One of the men, quick to revert to protocol, smiled at him and said, "We're ready to move forward with the consolidation once you sign, Adrian. The board has." Ayla held her breath. The moment compressed into a single hinge. Either he would sign because he trusted them, or he would see. Adrian folded his hands on the table and looked at the contracts. He smelled of coffee and something faintly like the sea, an oddly clean odor. He asked one question, gently, almost like the tilt of a jug asking how much water remained. "Why tonight? Why the urgency?" The polished woman's practiced features began to harden. "For strategic transparency," she said, and her voice carried the corporate rhythm, the language of rehearsed inevitability. "The market expects consolidation. We need to move swiftly to secure the stakeholders." Adrian's gaze swept the room slowly, and when it settled on the narrow-faced man, there was a softness so small it might have been mist, or it was a blade that cut through the pretense. "Are there contingencies?" he asked. "Hidden reallocations?" The narrow-faced man's composure flickered. "Certain protective clauses are standard," he said. "They ensure continuity." Adrian's jaw tightened. He placed a hand on the folder as if to anchor it. "We're not framing anyone, are we? We don't do. We do what ensures shareholder value," the polished woman said. Ayla watched his face with a kind of fierce hope. He had told her not to be afraid to speak up. He'd instructed her to tell him if she heard anything more. She had. He had come. She hoped, for reasons she couldn't wholly explain, that those were not merely good intentions in a man's speech. Adrian took a breath. "I want full transparency," he said. "No reallocation that's hidden. If you plan a consolidation, present it cleanly and fairly. If there are liabilities that will fall on me, I want them on the table now." A murmur ran around the table. The polished woman's eyes flashed. "We can't divulge every negotiating detail," she said, her voice sharp now. "That compromises strategy." "Strategy shouldn't mean deceit," Adrian said. There was an edge to his tone now, unmistakable to anyone who knew the language of command. "If you're proposing something that changes my position materially, I will not sign until I have legal counsel review and until we communicate clearly to stakeholders." It was not a show of power so much as a refusal to be played. Ayla felt her chest loosen in a small, private way. The men exchanged glances, and for the first time since she had been in the room, the polished woman seemed uncertain. "You heard the cleaner," she said, and the words were equal parts irritation and incredulity. "She's stirring up trouble." Adrian looked at Ayla and then at the men. He folded the folder shut, the motion deliberate. "We'll postpone any signatures," he said. "No one will sign tonight. I want counsel. I want the numbers clear. I want to know who benefits and how. If there's anything untoward, we stop it." The polished woman's face hardened into contained fury. "You can't delay this indefinitely," she said. "We won't delay it indefinitely," Adrian replied. "We'll delay it until I understand what I am signing. That's all." The room felt smaller, and the men began to talk in low voices, too low for Ayla to catch. The polished woman gathered the papers with a gesture that suggested the conversation was closed for now. They left the room in a flurry of professional discontent, shutting the door behind them with the neat finality of an act that wanted to be decisive. When the door clicked, Adrian turned to Ayla. "Are you all right?" he asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice. She nodded, a shaky, grateful nod. "You listened," she said. He smiled softly. "I couldn't do otherwise." He paused, regarding her with an attention that felt like recognition. "You were brave to speak up." Ayla's face flushed. "I didn't plan to be brave," she admitted. I thought of my mother." He reached into his pocket and handed her a plain envelope. "Get her something nice," he said. "For the roof, or for the light." Ayla took the envelope and found inside a card, modest but thoughtful, a voucher, a small sum that for a cleaner could mean a week of groceries without counting pennies. It was not charity, she told herself, it was gratitude, which sat differently in her chest. "You don't have to take it," Adrian said when he saw the hesitation. "I will," she said. "Thank you." As she left the room with her cart, the echo of their exchange followed her like a new map. The day resumed its pulse of meetings and emails, but somewhere beneath the business as usual, the board had found a crack. It would take work to pry it open, and not everyone would want it widened. Ayla's warning had been a small act, but it had set a motion that would not be easily stopped. Outside, the city shone with indifferent heat. On the bus home, Ayla thumbed the envelope between her fingers. It was small and real, the currency of ordinary mercy. She thought of her mother's hands, calloused and sure. She thought of the way signatures could take a life apart and how sometimes, out of the blue, someone with a quiet voice might ask the question that made the difference. In the corridors of power, plans had stalled. In a small apartment with a kitchen that needed mending, a woman would sleep easier that night. And in the glass tower where contracts waited for the ink of consequence, a decision had been postponed because a cleaner dared to speak into a room that assumed she did not belong. The building had a different kind of noise now, not the clean, anonymous hum of commuters, but the low, restless buzz of people who had noticed a stone dropped into still water. Rumors spread like draft air under doors, soft at first, then gathering into a breeze that tugged at hems and reputations. People who had never paid attention to the cleaning staff now found themselves glancing at Ayla's cart as it rolled past, as if the mop handle might contain a confession. She felt the change in small ways. The receptionist, Maya, who usually greeted her with a friendly nod, kept her voice clipped and her eyes darting toward the executive elevators. The men who used the 8th-floor bathrooms lingered a fraction longer as if to take her measure. Once, the junior interns who used to leave leftover sandwiches on the table now wrapped them and threw them away with an unnecessary politeness. Ayla tried to move beneath the current, to let the ripples pass her by. She concentrated on the simple arithmetic of her job, sweeping, mopping, the precise arc of the broom, the tiny victories of a corner made clean. But the corridor conversations threaded themselves through her day like hair caught on a comb. Security had a word with her. "Did you see the card?" Why would she know about contracts? None of it was mean-spirited yet, only curious, but curiosity is the first step toward accusation. It was the security guard, Jamal, who stopped her on a Wednesday morning as she pushed her cart down the quiet stairwell. "We need you to come with me for a moment," he said, and his voice was careful, the tone of someone who did not want to scare a neighbor but had been instructed to follow procedure. Ayla's heart dropped. She arranged the plastic bottles of cleaner on the lower shelf of the cart with hands that trembled. "For what?" "We have to ask you a few questions. Just to clear things up." He motioned to the security office at the side entrance where CCTV monitors painted the interior of the building in grainy blues and greens. Inside, the office smelled of coffee and old paper. Jamal offered her a chair while he tapped at the keyboard. 2 other guards sat across from him, their postures professional and neutral. For the first few minutes, the conversation was benign, questions about her shifts, the floors she cleaned, whether she had been in the conference room earlier. Their exact words were formal, but the pauses felt long. "You were seen entering conference room B after hours," the taller guard said finally. "Did anyone tell you to go in? Were you acting on somebody's instruction?" "No," Ayla said, each syllable careful. "I heard voices last night and I listened. I told Mr. Rowan because he's the CEO." Jamal's forehead creased. "Do you know if anyone asked you to do that? To cause a scene?" Ayla wanted to laugh, to say of course not, who would plan a scene with a woman who wore a mop-like armor? But she also knew how easily the world could fold stories into something they weren't. She said the truth. "No one told me. I wasn't trying to cause anything. I heard them." The guards exchanged a look that spoke more than the questions. In their eyes was the logic of the world. People have motives, and motives can be traced. They ran through the script of procedure and wrote down her answers with polite pens. By the time she walked back into the corridor, the small crowd had gathered, not openly but in the way shadows gather near a light. An intern who had once called her auntie paused to cough when she passed. The receptionist looked at her with uncertain tenderness. The building had not accused her aloud, but the undertone thrummed. An unexpected variable had entered the system, and systems do not like variables. It was the narrow-faced man, Elliot, who pushed the suspicion further. He was the sort of executive who could make a rumor sound like a news report. In a meeting that afternoon, with cameras off and the boardroom scent of expensive coffee thick, Elliot mentioned the word plant as if it were a technical term. "We need to consider the possibility that last night's disruption was staged," he said. "A controlled leak to test Mr. Rowan's reaction. Or worse, an attempt to deflect attention while someone manipulates the documents. We can't ignore that a staff member was present." The others murmured, and the word planted hung in the air like a charge. Adrian listened to the conversation, his face an even mask, but the thing inside him, an instinct that had been sharpened by years of being trusted and betrayed in equal measure, stirred. After the meeting, he asked for the security logs and watched the CCTV footage himself. He sat in the empty media room where the screens made a pale constellation. The grainy playback showed the corridor in a slow, impartial loop. A cleaner's trolley moved, a shadow crossed, footsteps echoed. He watched Ayla's figure, small, precise, as she had walked toward conference room B. He rewound the part where a shadow had retreated to the stairwell. There was a flicker at the landing, a flash of movement that might have been someone else slipping away. He froze the frame and zoomed in. The pixelated figure remained ambiguous, an ordinary shape with no name. The clearer footage, from an angle the guards pointed out, showed another detail. Someone had blocked one of the cameras earlier in the night for a brief period, just long enough for a pair of hands to adjust the lens. The timestamp was small and utilitarian, but it betrayed intent. Someone had wanted part of the corridor obscured. Adrian's chest tightened. The idea that Ayla might be a plant seemed less plausible than the possibility that she'd stumbled into something that had been deliberately hidden. He printed the clip and took it to his legal counsel. He did not share it with the board. He wanted to understand first. For a man who signed contracts to anchor futures, the smallest irregularity was as unforgivable as a crack in a dam. Word reached Ayla that the company was reviewing access logs, and with it came a new kind of attention. Her few colleagues at the cleaning agency, the others who shared bus rides and tales of thrift store finds, began to avoid certain topics around her. Her cousin Zara, who came by once a week to help with the rent, advised her to keep her head down. "It's better not to be seen until this blows over," Zara whispered, worry threaded through the softness in her voice. "People talk. They make things sharp." Ayla wanted to obey that sensible counsel. She wanted nothing more than to vanish into the monotony that had always protected her. But retreat felt like surrender. She had told the truth. She had warned. If being seen as someone who could speak truth was a danger, then perhaps the danger belonged not to her but to the people who wished to hide in the comfort of lies. The suspicion gnawed at her not because she doubted she had done anything wrong but because the world she'd lived in, small, ordered, defined by lists and receipts, had no language for being accused of courage. She had to keep sweeping, to prove she was ordinary again. When she pushed her mop down a hallway now, she felt like someone moving through a stage set where the audience had already whispered their verdict. Adrian's distance, too, shifted in ways that felt like betrayal even though he had good reason to be careful. He had been watched by other men that morning, the ones who had fought to move the signature forward. After his review of security footage, he became quieter in their presence, waiting and listening rather than confronting. He did not lash out at Ayla, he was not that kind of man, but he stopped leaving small notes on the break room table and he began to conduct his inquiries with that cool, professional remove that kept warmth at bay. When their paths crossed, the polite economy of earlier days tightened. He would nod in the hallway, but his eyes lingered a moment longer than before, as if searching for an angle. Ayla felt the change like a physical thing, a small withdrawal of trust that prickled against the tiny gratitude she still held for him. It hurt because she had not expected suspicion from someone whose face had offered her kindness. Gossip found its petty pleasures. Someone speculated that Ayla was a protégé, placed as a pawn in a chess match she had never been taught to play. Someone else suggested she had designed the whole episode to win favor. The absurdity of the claims was irrelevant. What mattered was how they threaded into perception. In a building where reputations were currency, perception could be a weapon. One evening, after a long day of windows and the kind of exhaustion that settled deep in the bones, Ayla found a sticky note tucked under the coffee machine in the staff room. The handwriting was unmistakable, clean, deliberate, the kind of line a person used when they had nothing to hide. It read, "You did the right thing. Be careful. A." Her fingers closed around the paper like a hand finding another hand in a crowd. She did not know whether it was a gesture of thanks or a sign of suspicion. She did not know if the note was left by the man who had once smiled and given her a number, or by some admirer who watched the drama unfold like a serialized show. It did not matter. The note was a tether, a small piece of human attention in a world that had begun to look at her as if she had committed some soft crime. That night, she slept unevenly. The building's lights burned far into the dark like a constellation that refused to blink. Each time she turned in bed, she imagined the paper under the pen's ink, the men in the conference room, the cameras with their lenses that could be blocked and unblocked like the eyelids of an indifferent god. Suspicion, she realized, was contagious. It moved faster than truth and lodged in the places that kindness had cleared. But it also threw up questions, small fissures that, if followed, might reveal a larger fracture. She did not yet know whose hand had covered the camera lens that night, or why, but she felt the tug of a decision forming, to step back into the groove and let the rumor settle, or to listen more closely for the sound of a plan being stitched together in a dark corner. In the quiet hours, she chose to listen. The boardroom smelled of leather and polished wood and the kind of expensive cologne that did not belong to the building's usual smells of lemon cleaner and printer ink. Afternoon light slanted through floor-to-ceiling glass and cut the table into bright ribbons. Outside, the city moved on in its habitual hurry. Inside, time had the thicker quality of something being held purposely at the hinge. Adrian sat at the head of the table with the folder laid flat before him. There were fewer men than the last meeting, some had been placated, others kept at bay, but the most important faces were present: the polished woman with the glossy nails, Elliot with his narrow, observant profile, and two board members who wore their age like an armor of signatures. A legal advisor from a firm had taken a chair at Adrian's right, a quiet man who preferred to let clauses speak instead of rhetoric. The documents were arranged with military neatness, a stack of originals, a second set marked for signatures, and an exhibit packet that had been engraved with the company crest. On the top sheet, beneath the paragraph that appeared to encapsulate the whole move, there was a line for a name and, above it, a waiting pen in a stand that gleamed too brightly under the light. The meeting had been presented to Adrian as a clarification session. "We want to make sure you understand all the moving parts," Elliot had said with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "We want this to be clean and quick." Adrian had listened. He had read more than anyone expected. He had called counsel. He had asked questions that made the polished woman's practiced responses falter, just enough to force her to speak plainly where she had preferred the soft padding of euphemism. Yet there were concessions, promises of explanatory memos, assurances that the reallocation would be structurally harmless and stakeholder positive. The men had framed it as a strategic retreat that would preserve the company's market position while allowing him to step back gracefully if he so wished. He had, until now, been inclined to trust the language of corporate necessity. The contracts were thick with terms, the lawyers spoke of indemnities and escrow accounts. The city's lights outside the glass were steady and indifferent. He had signed bigger things before: donations, project charters, letters of intent, and every signature felt, in its way, like a closing of a door and the opening of another. He had told himself he would not be hurried. He had told himself transparency would win out. Yet there was pressure, investors who wanted certainty, a stock price that never slept, and a board cadre practiced in soft persuasion. They had chosen a moment when the schedule was tight, and the day's noise could be made to seem like momentum. Adrian picked up the pen. It was heavy in his hand, a small comet of metal hovered over the paper. The room held its breath as if the ink itself could be an instrument of fate. Then the door at the far end of the room swung open and a rush of cold air burst in. Ayla stood there, hair tucked messily under her scarf, breathless, her uniform dusted with the faint grit of the late-night corridors. Her mop bucket had been abandoned near the reception, and her hands, raw from work, were empty. For a moment she seemed too small for the brightness of the room. For another, she was the only thing that cut the glare. "Stop," she said, and the single syllable detonated more strongly than any argument. The room reacted like a body struck, swivel chairs clicked, coffee cups tipped slightly, and Elliot's face went a shade paler. Conversation stalled and then recoiled. The polished woman rose so quickly her chair scraped back a harsh note. "Security," she barked, as if summoning order would scrub the interruption clean. "How did she get in here?" Adrian stared at Ayla. The pen trembled in his fingers but did not fall. There was a suspended second when the air tasted of metal and the hush between people who had been sure of their narrative. Adrian started, then stopped. The word that might have become a reproach died in his mouth. The memory of the stairwell, of the business card in her pocket, of the courage in her voice, steadied him. He set the pen down beside the folder with a gentleness that felt like a refusal to be manipulated by theatrics. Olya's chest heaved. Her eyes were wide, earnest, and rimmed with a fatigue that had nothing to do with the night's work and everything to do with nights lived in fear of signatures. "Please," she said. "Please don't sign it." The polished woman's smile returned, a razor of propriety. "This room is not open to staff," she said, her voice clipped with the discipline of someone who had always believed boundaries protected the world. "You will leave immediately." "No," Ayla said, louder now, because the pen was a small threat and the words on paper were the kind of weather that could uproot a life. "There are clauses, there are reallocations hidden in the exhibits. They're shifting assets into an LLC that will be controlled by the very committee proposing the consolidation. They'll be placing liabilities in your name after the optics are arranged. You can't," her voice found the cadence of a truth-teller. "He won't see it in time." Silence swelled, then split. Someone from the legal team rose, moving with the composed certainty of someone who read for loopholes. "Madam, these are serious allegations to make without proof," the lawyer said. "We'll need you to state your evidence." Ayla's mouth trembled, but she did not back down. "There's a clause in Section 4.2, she said, and she had learned to say the numbers as if they were spells. "It references Schedule C. If you take the fee structure on page 13 and combine it with the deferred liability subsection, it creates a trigger. The assets move and the liabilities remain attached to Adrian's personal guarantee." Her fingers, clean in their bluntness, found the edge of the table. "I don't have the exhibits, but I heard them. I heard the phrases. I heard it framed to make him look generous." Adrian's legal counsel's eyes tightened. The lawyer looked at him as if measuring how much air he had left in his lungs for surprise. "Sir," the lawyer said quietly, "we can delay and review." Elliot's jaw set. "This woman is making allegations based on eavesdropping," he snapped. "She's not an expert. We can't let—" "No," Adrian said. The word landed with unaccustomed authority. He rose, leaving the pen where it lay, and walked around the table until he stood close to Ayla. The room contracted their attention as if his movement were the main event. "You heard them," he said, quiet but uncompromising. "You heard words they meant to hide. You came here to tell me. Are you lying?" Ayla looked at him and did not flinch. "No," she said. "I am not lying. I'm a cleaner. I have no reason to make this up. Her voice wavered. "I know what a signature can take." There was an absurd, fragile humanity in the scene, a man with the fate of a company in ink standing next to a woman whose fate was measured in electricity bills and bus fares. In the polished woman's eyes there was a doctrine of propriety she believed would protect the order. In Elliot's there was the guarded arithmetic of political survival. Outside the glass, a construction crane swung its slow arm, indifferent to the drama of human paper. "Security," the polished woman repeated, but her voice no longer had the sharpest edge. The room needed a decision, and decisions require evidence. For all their strategizing, the conspirators had left a sliver of daylight. Someone had to get inside the exhibits to place the allocations. If Ayla's fragment of overheard speech mapped onto reality, then a forensic review of the papers would reveal the mischief. But if it did not, if she were an instigator, then the cost would be awkward and reputational. Elliot leaned forward. "If we're to believe her, then she must be shown the exhibits," he said, cautious, trying to craft a path between accusation and the threat of delay. "Open the attachments. Let her identify the clauses." The polished woman's mouth hardened. "We cannot let non-authorized personnel handle confidential papers." Adrian's gaze was steady. "You'll bring in counsel," he said. "We'll put a hold on signatures until legal can confirm there is no misrepresentation. If there's nothing, we proceed. If there is, we halt it until it is corrected." There was a murmur of nerves. The polished woman's fingers fluttered across the exhibits with a practiced possessiveness. She hesitated, but the sting of being asked to wait, of having transparent process applied to her plan, settled on her like a rebuke. She motioned to an assistant. "Get counsel," she said. The assistant left in a bright flurry of heels and glossy hair. Ayla sagged slightly, relief and dread mingling like two liquids. Relief because the pen stayed down. Dread because she had stepped into a room that could turn her into either a parable or a pawn. "Madam," the legal advisor said gently to Ayla, "if you can tell us more, where you heard the reference to Schedule C, who said it?" Ayla's eyes flicked to the door, to the assistant who had left, to the blank walls that might hold cameras she could not see. "It was late," she said. "I was cleaning. They thought no one could hear. They said reallocation and deferred liabilities and optics, and they laughed when they said he wouldn't read the fine print. They spoke like it was a stage trick." Elliot's face tightened as if someone had handed him a ledger with unfamiliar numbers. If this is what it seems, then we need an immediate audit," he said. "We can brief the audit committee, freeze signatures, and we call in external counsel," Adrian finished. "We treat this as a serious irregularity." The polished woman's nostrils flared, and for a heartbeat she looked almost adolescent, angry at being thwarted not through reason but by procedure. "This is absurd," she said. "We cannot paralyze the company every time an employee overhears a snippet." "You don't have to paralyze anything," Adrian said, "only to ensure that anything requiring my signature is fully transparent before I sign it. That is reasonable." A hush settled again, the kind of quiet that comes before people decide which of themselves they will be. Then, from the corridor beyond the glass wall, someone clapped once, slow and sarcastic. Heads turned. The assistant had returned, but she was not alone. A pair of men in suits stood behind her with the lean authority of security. One of them carried a small tablet that displayed an access log with timestamps. At the bottom was an entry marked 5 minutes earlier, camera obstruction override. The name attached to the override was a board assistant, now looking suddenly less composed. The room jolted in that new frame of reality. Secrets, like cracks, widened when the light found them. Ayla, who had only wanted ink not to become a ruin, watched the ripple of exposure. In the blurred edge between courage and consequence, she felt something that belonged to a human truth. Sometimes the world answers when someone small refuses to be silent. The pen lay next to the folder, unlifted. The signatures waiting like tiny constellations would have to wait. The almost signature was now a question mark in the ledger of their lives. Outside, the city continued to hurry, unaware that for a moment an ordinary voice had paused a potentially catastrophic act and forced a room of powerful people to consider the weight of what they did with a line of ink. For an hour after Ayla left the boardroom, the corridor felt like the calm after a thunderclap, not peaceful, exactly, but charged. News moved faster than gossip when it had weight behind it. The security override, the halted signature, the fact of a cleaning woman's interruption, all of it echoed through the glass and into the offices of people who had thought themselves untouchable. Adrian did not return to his private suite. He stayed in the conference room and called in everyone who mattered: legal, internal audit, external counsel. He insisted the IT department produce their full log and demanded the camera footage be preserved. His voice was not loud. It simply carried the authority of someone who had decided the day's contour. The legal advisor, Thomas Gray, the quiet man who preferred clauses to flourish, sat with the exhibits spread like a map before him. He moved precisely, like a man disentangling string. He put Exhibit C under the scanner and he checked the footer, the metadata, the timestamps. It was boring, meticulous work, the kind of labor that revealed truth by playing itself out through patience. "We'll run a forensic comparison," Thomas said. "If they've swapped schedules, edited exhibits, or backdated documents, the audit trail will show it. We'll also look at the LLCs and any accounts tied to them. If this is what it appears to be, we'll have a paper trail so long it won't be able to hide." Adrian nodded. "And Ayla?" he asked. "We'll want her to make a statement," Thomas said. "But we'll protect her. She's a witness in a potential internal fraud investigation. We'll treat her accordingly." The word protect made Ayla's chest tighten when she heard it later that day. She was summoned, not to the executive floor, but to a small, neutral room where the air smelled of refrigerator coffee and the wallpaper had a bland, calming tone. She was not cuffed. They offered her tea and a chair that could have been designed for comfort. Adrian sat across from her, and his eyes were tired and grateful. "You were right," he said simply. "We found irregularities in the exhibits. We're still sorting the extent, but there's something wrong." Ayla's fingers had been folded together for hours. "Do you blame me?" she asked, immediately ashamed of asking it. She had already felt the sting of suspicion, the way colleagues' eyes changed. She hoped the truth would be a kind of balm. Adrian reached across the small table and placed his hand over hers in a small, deliberate act that made her fingers flutter. "No," he said. "If anything, you reminded me of what I should have been doing all along, reading carefully, trusting less the practiced words of convenience. You did the right thing." He ordered the company's private legal counsel to proceed with discretion. In the days that followed, the forensic team pulled up a web of documents that had been artfully stitched together. Schedule C existed in a draft in a secure folder that only a handful of senior staff could access. Someone had produced a finalized version and slipped it into the stack bound for the signature packet. Metadata showed it had been altered hours before the meeting. Access logs showed the edit had been committed by a user profile linked to the polished woman's assistant, but the assistant's credentials had been used remotely, and the trace led further, toward a server that belonged to an external consultant who had been advising the board on restructuring. The auditors dug deeper. The LLC named in the disputed clauses had been registered through an intermediary shell company, and its beneficial owners traced back to an entity with connections to one of the board members. The paper trail was labyrinthine, but the pattern was there, deliberate obfuscation for personal gain. When the auditors presented the summary to Adrian, his face did not betray the storm inside. He looked like a man trying to hold a ship steady while the hull was being examined for holes. "This shows intent," he said finally. "Someone engineered the path so that assets could be diverted without transparency. They counted on my trust and on process obscuring their moves." "Sir," Thomas said, "we can take this to the board. We can freeze any transfers implicated and initiate a formal inquiry. If necessary, we inform the regulators." Adrian folded his hands. "Do it," he said. "But do it with care. I don't want to put a woman who works night shifts into the middle of something she never asked for." They moved like that, a combination of speed and circumspection. There were tactical calls: who to notify first, how to preserve evidence, how to limit the fallout to the company without letting the perpetrators erase the trail. The room they convened in at noon was cold with the air of officialdom. The board members assembled under a shadow of suspicion. The polished woman, Vivienne Hale, Vice President of Corporate Strategy, had the look of someone who believed she could explain everything away with a carefully constructed narrative. Her posture was perfect. Her smile, however, seemed to be struggling. "You're accusing me?" she asked, voice satin and surprised. Adrian placed Thomas's printouts on the table. The forensic analysis glowed like small punitive constellations across the screen. Vivienne's assistant's access had been used. The consultant's IP had been part of the edit trail. An LLC named Meridian Holdings had been set up in a jurisdiction with lax transparency laws, and its beneficial owner records had an indirect link to a holding company associated with a board member. Vivienne's eyes darted. "This is circumstantial," she said. "You can't attribute intent from metadata. If there's a problem, it's procedural, not malicious." Elliot's face was grey, a ledger of emotion. His fingers drummed a small, nervous rhythm against the tablecloth. He had been careful with his language, but the audit had not been kind to safe assumptions. Adrian did not shout. He did not need to. He let the numbered evidence speak, and then, quietly, he did something the board did not anticipate. He invited Ayla into the meeting. She entered as if entering another kind of light, carrying the worn weight of work and the newer weight of being central to something that mattered. People shifted in their seats. Some avoided looking at her. Others could not take their eyes off the lines of determination that had always been in her face. "You heard things the night before," Adrian said, standing. "You came forward. That's why we halted the signature. I invited you in because you are central to what happened." Vivienne's lip twitched. "We can't have employees playing amateur investigators," she said tartly. Ayla's voice was steady but soft. "I don't want to be an investigator," she said. "I swept a hallway. I heard men talk and I told the man in charge. I only want the truth to be known." The legal team corroborated her account. The forensic data lined up with her memory. Whoever had planned the reallocation had relied on the momentum of a signature and the opacity of the exhibits. They had assumed no one would listen in the shadows. When the meeting adjourned, Vivienne left as if the air had burned her. Elliot's features were closed, and his eyes revealed an accounting of consequence that left him quieter than before. The board placed freezes on the implicated transfers and suspended the assistant pending inquiry. External counsel sent letters to the jurisdiction authorities to request beneficial owner data and set the wheels of legal accountability into motion. Ayla's world tilted and then steadied. The company moved to protect her anonymity from the press. Adrian insisted no statement be made without her consent. He appointed a liaison so she had a person to talk to and arranged for the company to cover any immediate expenses she might need. Not charity, he corrected privately, but practical care. That evening, Ayla sat at her small kitchen table and touched the envelope Adrian had once given her. The letter inside had become not a mere token but a covenant. He had listened, and listening had saved something. Her mother called and asked if she had eaten. Ayla lied a little and said yes, because she did not want to tell her mother the building had been a battlefield and she had been a voice in it. She thought instead of the house where she had watched signatures take light and warmth away and felt a strange, private satisfaction, that a different kind of signature, a mark not yet made, might not steal as easily again. But the truth had been revealed in more ways than one. The auditors had found the scheme. The board was fractured. The men who had thought themselves safe had to reckon with exposure. And Ayla, ordinary, brave, unassuming, had been both the catalyst and the witness. Night came down with the quiet ordinary of the city. The scandal's edges were only just beginning to be aired. There would be hearings and statements and the slow mechanics of accountability. For Ayla, for Adrian, for the men who had plotted and for those who had believed in the sanctity of kindness, the days ahead would require things that were not just legal. Courage to hold to truth when cost demanded compromise. As she turned off the single light in her small kitchen and stacked the dishes, Ayla felt the heavy kindness of being seen. It was a strange, fragile comfort. The truth had been revealed, but it had also opened a longer road, one that would test loyalties, reputations, and the bravery of a woman who had simply answered the sound of a wrong being planned and decided not to look away. The fallout moved through the building like winter. Where once the days had been measured in forecasts and quarterly plans, now everything had the brittle quality of something freshly cracked. Meetings multiplied. Emails stacked like confetti. Legal memos arrived as if by tide. For some, the word fraud was typed into a draft and deleted 3 times before it was sent. For others, the implication was a slow, private reckoning. The people they trusted were not infallible. Adrian sat in his office less and worked more. He read contracts on his own, line by line, the way someone reads a map before a journey. He spoke with auditors until the small hours and convened ethics workshops with an energy that was part penance and part resolve. The company's public relations team prepared measured statements. The board retreated into the bunker of counsel and restrained language. But behind all the bureaucratic choreography, 2 separate things were happening: damage control and a quieter, more exacting search for who had wanted him to sign away his own future. It was the quieter work that consumed him. He took the forensic reports home and read them while the city's nightlights smeared themselves across his window. He traced the arithmetic of transfers and shell entities until he could see the fingerprints, financial habits and routing that were not random but deliberate. Whoever had engineered the plan knew how to coax figures into seeming ordinary. They had crafted an appearance of legitimacy and leveraged trust as their instrument. And yet in 2 places their handiwork had failed. A camera lens had been obstructed for too long, and a cleaner had been listening. There were people who bristled at his insistence on precision. Elliot, who had once favored expediency, pressed for a faster, quieter resolution. "We can settle this internally," Elliot urged one morning. "We don't have to drag regulators into everything. The company can absorb legal costs. We can close ranks." Adrian heard the pitch and the reason behind it: speed, optics, the avoidance of scandal. He thought of the families who had been saved by the scholarships he'd authorized, of the community programs dependent on the company's integrity. He thought of his own name being used to cloak a scheme. "No," he said to Elliot with a firmness that surprised even him. "If someone engineered this for personal benefit, they must be held to account. If we sweep it under the rug to preserve a share price or a comfort, we become what they hoped we would be." Elliot's face closed. "You're risking the company's value for principle." "I'm preventing theft and protecting our stakeholders," Adrian answered. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." Word of the inquiry leaked, as it always did when so many hands touched a story. The first articles were clinical: company halts transfer pending inquiry, and then the tone shifted as unnamed sources added flourishes. Headlines are hungry things, they fed on suspicion and built citadels of rumor. Vivienne's name hovered in the margins of pieces like a shadow without a body. She maintained her innocence publicly and privately laced a different path through the building. Shorter lunches, fewer smiles, eyes like coin. Ayla's life had shifted in smaller but sharper ways. The company's liaison, a careful woman named Syra, had been assigned to make sure Ayla felt safe. She offered options, temporary relocation of shifts, financial assistance while things were ongoing, and the promise that the company would not place her in the center of public attention. Ayla accepted the practical help with a quiet gratitude and refused the spotlight with the sort of dignity that made Syra's supervisor take notes. Yet safety is a fragile thing when curiosity wants a story. Interns who had once joked with her started to avoid her cart as if their proximity might smear them with scandal. An unverified social post painted her as an insider hero, while a terse corporate memo labeled her a witness. The polarities made her feel oddly exposed, celebrated and scrutinized, both at once. When the investigators called her to ask more detailed questions, she answered with the same steady frankness she had always used. She described voices and phrases and the cadence of men who believed their words were private. She told them where she had been in the corridor and what she had seen, how the assistant had left and returned hurried and nervous. She described the way the explanations had been rehearsed, the casual laughter that was meant to make theft sound like business. The auditors catalogued everything as if placing beads on a string, every tiny detail fitted, and the necklace grew heavy. One thing she didn't tell them, because it was a small private truth she preferred to hold, was how she had lain awake some nights wondering if the attention would last and what would happen when it left. The world that had noticed her once might not notice her again. She worried not for herself, but for the small, careful ecosystem of life she maintained. Bills, family, a mother who liked her victuals measured, a cousin who needed a bus ticket now and then. She had chosen to speak, and the consequences were not all victory or even clarity. There was fear sifting through the gratitude. Adrian, meanwhile, faced the problem of proximity. He had said he would protect her, and he meant it, yet protection in an organization is a political act. He assigned a trusted internal counsel to be her point person and arranged for her to have paid leave if she wanted it. He asked Syra to check in, to bring groceries if she was short. He felt a strange, continual urge to watch over the small details of her life, the broken light bulb that needed replacing, the bus tokens that might save a trip, because the act of someone listening in the dark had become, for him, a luminous debt. He was careful to keep the gestures small. He would not recruit gratitude into something transactional. Investigations are like the curious unspooling of threads. One thread led to another and then another. The forensic accountants mapped an arc from an offshore transfer back to a domestic shell and then to a series of smaller accounts. They traced invoices that had been marked consulting but in which the services were vaporous. A tax document revealed a payment that made no sense, an amount that fit not any market rate but a comfortable margin for someone who had engineered a redistribution. The ledger, when viewed across time, told a story that made whole the fragmentary evidence the auditors had first found. A hearing was scheduled by the board of directors, not a show trial but the kind of sober session where lawyers spoke in plain, large-hearted syllables and where the room's air felt like a ledger's paper. Vivienne was asked to attend. She arrived with an immaculate suit and lashes that could be dialed to the precise measure of indignation. Elliot sat across the table from her with a face the color of stretched linen. "We are not assuming guilt," Thomas told the board calmly, "but the data compels a formal inquiry. There are changes in document versions, access anomalies, and financial movements that require explanation." Vivienne bristled. "You're circling me because I led the initiative," she said. "That's a convenient narrative." "Convenience is not our concern," Adrian said. "Clarity is." Her assistant's suspension became official the next day. The assistant had used her credentials to access a restricted folder at an odd hour and then logged out through an obscure gateway that masked the endpoint. The assistant maintained she had not acted maliciously. She said she had been retrieving something at the direction of her supervisor. The investigator's role, increasingly, was to follow the chain down to its origin rather than to stop at the convenient stop. In a moment that made the building lean a little closer to truth, evidence suggested a connection between the shell entities and a board member who had occasionally advised on private acquisitions. The relationship was tangential, not a clean line but a rope with many twists, and yet it was enough to justify involving regulators. Adrian signed the request. He felt a cold clarity then, Once this moved beyond the company to the regulators, there would be no gentle hands and no private discretion. There would be subpoenas and hearings and a public ledger. But for him the choice was simple: transparency or complicity. Vivian, who had once moved through hallways as if the building were attuned to her rhythm, now found fewer doors open. People who had smiled before offered only curt nods. Her strategy was to insist on innocence and to push for internal reconciliation. She called meetings and offered spreadsheets and explanations that smelled of competence. But in the quiet of her apartment, the edges of her composure were fraying. She began to wonder if the architecture of power she had built could falter on a small thing like a camera lens and a cleaner's ears. Not all fractures were public. Some alliances quietly shifted. Elliot, who had favored saving face for the company, found himself relegated to a role in which his suggestions were heard but no longer given primacy. Others who had been complicit in the earlier expediency found their contracts renegotiated or their projects shelved. The ripple of the audacity to manipulate a consolidation reached corners no one expected. Vendors asked for clarifications, junior managers revised their approaches, and the HR department retrained teams on whistleblower protections. For Ayla, the immediate importance was practical. The company transferred a modest sum to her account to cover short-term expenses and arranged for her to have flexible hours. She declined most of the visibility. She did not want her face on morning programs. But she accepted an offer she did not expect. The company invited her mother to the building to accept, on Ayla's behalf, a gift that would finally seal a repair long overdue, the replacement of the roof that had once been the last straw in a chain of small, painful losses. Ayla went to the ceremony and watched her mother, whose face creased into something like wonder as workers inspected the new tiles and the scaffolding that had arrived to protect a small, ordinary house. In the quiet that followed the roof ceremony, as confetti from a corporate publicity photo drifted down like pale leaves, Ayla felt a complicated wash of feelings: relief that those nights of worry were eased, pride that a debt had been returned, and a discomfort with the way kindness had been transmuted into a quiet public performance. She wanted nothing of spectacle. She wanted the ordinary dignity of safe nights and predictable bills. One night, as the investigations wound their slow path, Vivienne was called into a meeting she had not wanted. The board recommended suspension pending the outcome of the regulator's inquiry. The move was strategic, not a declaration of guilt but a way to preserve the company's operations while questions were resolved. For Vivienne, it was a falling away of a life she had carefully curated. When she left the building that evening with a small case and a face that tried to hold its pride, she encountered a crowd of reporters who had finally been given the green light to ask questions. They shouted, jostling for angles. Vivienne kept her silence and moved with a measured dignity. In the press scrum, though, there was an odd quiet, an empathy that lives around those who have been brought low, and a sharpness too, for she had been the one whose strategies and choices had precipitated the whole mess. Through it all, Adrian kept his seat as if he were part of the scaffolding holding the company upright. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hours he spent at his desk. It was the fatigue of holding to a principle in the face of expediency and slow conspiracies. He would come back to the thought that had anchored him since the night Ayla had spoken, that things are kept honest not by the people who profit from them but by the people who stand in the corridors and speak when they hear a wrong. There would be hearings and restitution and probably, for those who had made the consolidations a vehicle for personal gain, consequences. The board's fracture would not be simple to mend. The company's valuation might wobble for a while. Investors would grumble and then resettle. But some things were reset, processes tightened, access logs monitored more carefully, whistleblower protections made louder and clearer. What had been hidden, by design, had been forced into the light. For Ayla, for Adrian, and for the company, a hard lesson had been learned. Trust is not a currency to be spent recklessly. It is not a signature to be gifted without looking. Some doors, once opened, do not simply close again. They change the architecture of the rooms they lead to. That late evening, when the city's noise thinned and the building seemed to breathe again, Adrian walked down to the staff room where the cleaning crew ate together. He carried a thermos of hot tea and a quiet gratitude. He found Ayla there, among the laughter of colleagues and the comfortable clatter of mugs. He sat and listened without grand gestures, and in the small exchange that passed between them, two people from very different worlds sharing a cup, there was a kind of equilibrium restored. The deal had been broken, not in the sense of small failure, but in the sense that the attempt to steal by legal camouflage had been dismantled. Whatever plans had been laid to reallocate and to profit had not succeeded. The damage to human trust, however, would take longer to repair. The men who had planned the scheme would now learn what it meant for a company that once moved as an organism of habit to be forced into the slow, honest work of accounting for its own choices. In the months that followed, the company would change. Some of it would be weary and procedural: new checks, revised signatory processes, an elevated role for counsel. Some of it would be more human, a culture that, shaken by exposure, grew a cautious humility. And somewhere in a small apartment with a roof that no longer leaked, Ayla swept the floors with the same practiced motions, but now there was a new smallness in her steps, less the invisibility she had always known and more the gentle awareness of a life altered by a truth she had refused to let slide. After the hearings and the quiet adjustments, the building breathed easier, but the air between people still carried a residue of what had happened, an invisible salt that stung when touched. For Adrian, gratitude sat in his chest like a small, persistent stone. He found himself replaying the night Ayla had walked into the boardroom with her mop bucket abandoned like a flag. He had not expected a janitor to alter the course of corporate machinery. He had not expected to be grateful in a way that unsettled him. Gratitude, for a man who signed futures into being, was a strange new responsibility. He wanted to thank her in more than formalities. A card and a certificate from the company felt sterile next to the human thing she had done. He kept picturing his leather folder on the table and the pen he put down because someone with no title had demanded he see. He owed her more than a press release could offer. He wanted something honest, something that said, plainly, "I saw you." But he also had a pride he did not like to admit, a fear of being seen as transactional, of using his resources to smooth his conscience. Part of him worried that an act of generosity could be mistaken for a performance, for a man buying himself absolution. Ayla lived on the other side of that ledger. Pride was a currency she guarded carefully, earned by labor, spent in small, necessary ways. She was not hungry for public thanks. She had, in her life, learned to measure worth in things less flashy than applause. Yet she also carried private debts and deferred dreams. She had left school not because she wanted to, but because life required immediate survival. There were books she had never been able to buy, experiences she had shelved like old clothes. The company's email offering her assistance arrived with bureaucratic warmth. She appreciated the help but bristled at the phrase. She did not want to be tokenized, labeled the cleaner who saved the CEO, pinned under a headline and propped up as a symbol. Their first formal meeting after the inquiry was arranged by Syra, the liaison, in a way that tried to be unobtrusive. She suggested Adrian drop by the staff room for tea and invited only a few people, a casual interlude to mend social fabric. It was both small and charged with the potential to go wrong. Ayla agreed to come. She would not refuse a cup of honest tea nor the chance to sit with the ordinary life she had chosen. Adrian arrived with a thermos again, not grand gestures, just a human act he felt comfortable with. He had thought through how to thank her without making a spectacle, a private note, a suggestion of help, a discreet offer. But when he walked into the staff room and saw her, hair tucked under a scarf, hands still warm from work, his practiced caution softened into an awkward earnestness. "You don't have to make a scene," she said, smiling a little as if to deflect the anxiety she saw in him. "I'm not trying to," he replied, but his voice betrayed the rehearsal of gratitude in his chest. He set the thermos down and poured 2 cups, fumbling the lid as if his hands had somewhere to go with their nervousness. Syra cleared her throat and left them alone with the low hum of a kettle. "I'll check the schedules," she offered and slipped away like someone giving privacy to 2 people on a small stage. Adrian sat opposite Ayla, and for a while they drank in silence, the kind of silence that is not absence but a held conversation. Outside, the building carried on its work, oblivious to the minute being unwrapped in that back room. "I wanted to," he began, and then stopped. The words were stubborn. He tried again. "I wanted to thank you properly. Not with corporate platitudes, but," he looked for the shape of the thing he wanted to give. "Is there anything you need? Anything I can do?" Ayla set her cup down and studied him with an attention that was both careful and kind. She had been taught to accept help sideways, to wrap gratitude in practical returns. "Food?" she asked lightly, because in her world sometimes the simplest answer was the truest. "No," Adrian said with a soft laugh. "Something better than that, then." He had thought of many things, a bonus paid into her account, a year's worth of grocery vouchers, an offer of paid leave, even the ridiculous thought of hiring her into a different position to remove the awkwardness of class lines. Each idea felt both generous and uncomfortably invasive. He worried the check might be a public altar for his relief. He feared the job offer might feed headlines more than dignity. He wanted to do something that recognized her intellect and her agency rather than simply buying silence with money. "You should finish whatever you wanted to do," he said suddenly, surprising them both. "If you ever wanted to go back to school, there are evening classes, scholarships. I can help arrange things. If education is something you wanted but life closed a door on, I would like to open it." Ayla blinked. The suggestion landed between them like a question and a gift at once. She had not told him she'd once been at the top of her class, not because she hid it but because it had been a private wound. Hearing the offer unstuck something warm and anxious in her chest. "It's kind," she said slowly. "Unexpected." "Then I'll stop calling it charity," he said, with a half-smile that aimed for sincerity. "Call it an investment. In you. In the person you could become if circumstances allowed. No publicity, no strings. I'll simply cover tuition and any materials. If you don't want it, I'll understand. I don't want to pressure you." There was care in his tone that felt like a hand held out at the waist level of respect. But even as it felt generous, Ayla's pride stiffened. Accepting would put her in a new position, one that would shift the balance in her relationships and open doors that locked other doors. There was a public story about a cleaning lady and a CEO now. Joining an evening class paid by him might invite whispers that she'd been bought. Her independence had always been quiet. This was suddenly loud. "Why would you do that?" she asked finally, because the honest question sat heavy. "Why me?" "Because you saved me from something I should never have been blind to," he said. "Because you didn't accept the world's script that said your voice didn't matter. Because," he paused, then added with unforced humility, "because you made me better at my job, and that's not something I can explain in numbers." Ayla's eyes glistened. She felt the tug of two currents, the relief of a promised possibility and the unease of being beholden. She thought of her mother, sleeping with the light off to save the meter, and of Zara's cautious optimism. Education had been a hunger she'd carried quietly. It was not just about certificates, it was about finishing sentences she had left mid-word. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "I don't want to be some story in the press, heroine turned protégé. I want to be me. If I do this, I want it because I want it, not because someone thinks they fixed me." "Of course," Adrian replied immediately. "No headlines. No fanfare. Just an offer. And nothing will change at work unless you want it to. Ever." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the vulnerability beneath his composed surface. He was not offering charity to salve public opinion, he was offering a door he could open with no expectation of theatrical returns. That mattered. They spoke then of small, practical things, times for classes, what subjects might fit her interests, the quiet logistics of study and shifts. He listened more than he spoke, and the conversations were not about money but about possibilities, what it would feel like to read at table with a lamp and a notebook, to sit in a class and not count the minutes until the bus, to write a paper that belonged to her. The world outside the staff room still hummed with gossip and recalibration. Some staff whispered that Adrian was being sentimental, others believed him. For Vivienne and her cohort, the offer might look like a PR stopgap. But the way the two of them spoke in that small room was honest in ways no headline could frame. Later, as they rose to leave, Adrian placed in Ayla's hand a small leather notebook and a pen, nothing extravagant, but an object that symbolized an invitation to write, to plan, to practice. "No strings," he said. "If you want to use it to draft a class application, or to write a grocery list, it's yours." Ayla turned the notebook over in her hand. The leather was soft and the pages smelled faintly of new paper. She felt a warmth that had nothing to do with paternalism or pity. It felt, for once, like an acknowledgement that someone had looked and decided to help in a way that respected her choice. She accepted the notebook. Outside the staff room, the building glided by in its ordinary motions. People filed past, carrying files and coffees, unaware of the shifting small acts behind the scenes. For Ayla and Adrian, the exchange had changed the shape of something private. There would be more decisions to be made, how visible she wanted the help to be, whether she would take classes, how she would arrange life around work, but the first step was honest. That night, as she tucked the little notebook into her bag, Ayla felt the familiar prickle of pride. She would not let herself be bought. She would not let gratitude be a chain. But the seed of possibility had been planted in a place that had, surprisingly, space to grow. And in the quiet of her small kitchen, she opened the first page and, with a steady hand, wrote her name at the top, Ayla, so that the paper might one day bear paragraphs she had always wanted to finish. After the gift of the notebook and the quiet conversation in the staff room, something between Ayla and Adrian changed that neither of them could name without sounding foolish. It wasn't dramatic, no slammed doors or angry words, but the geometry of their encounters shifted. The corridor had always been a place of passing, now it carried an undercurrent, a strand of tension neither wanted but both noticed when it snagged. Ayla returned to her routines with the same deliberate care she always had, the methodical sweep of corners, the ritual of wringing a mop until the water ran clear, the small victories of a hallway restored to order. But under the steady cadence of her work she kept a practiced distance. Where once the exchange between them had been simple, he gave a thermos, she accepted a cup, now each greeting felt like an event to be navigated. She found herself trimming her smile before it became too warm, keeping her answers spare. There was a delicate fear that any familiarity might be misread, turned into a public spectacle, or worse, made into charity wrapped in a bow. People noticed. Some smiled in a way that meant how easily things can be cleaned up, but others watched with a sharper curiosity, trying to map alliances where there were none. Office gossip, ever hungry, grew teeth. "Did you see them at lunch?" one of the junior analysts whispered. "He keeps visiting the staff room." "She takes his offers," another said. The currency of scandal is quick, it buys traction with half a rumor. Ayla began to feel the weight of those whispers like a second uniform. She resented being on anyone's map in that way. To her, the offer Adrian had made was a door, possibly useful, maybe dangerous, but it was a door she wanted to open on her own terms. She feared that if she crossed it too publicly, she would no longer be herself, she would be a story. So she retreated in the most human way she knew. She made herself smaller where the public could see her and larger where privacy allowed. Adrian, for his part, found the change like a new weather system he had not learned to read. He had expected gratitude or awkwardness, perhaps relief. He had not expected silence. He noticed how she shifted away when he approached, how her smile dimmed just enough to make him question whether his presence was comfort or imposition. He tried small things, leaving another thermos, asking Syra if she needed anything, but he felt a growing distance that made his chest tighten, a distance he had not anticipated after the intimacy of the boardroom and the small tea in the staff room. He told himself he would not be the kind of man who coerced gratitude. He reminded himself of the promise, no publicity, no strings. Yet there was a selfishness in his wanting that she accept him comfortably, to be able to see her and have the memory of that moment be uncomplicated. He had always been good at making decisions in the language of certainty, numbers, clauses, signatures. But people did not translate into spreadsheets. People were messy, full of pride and shame and the small, hidden currencies of daily life. So both of them invented polite distances to keep the other safe from what might be misread. The building, which had once staged their accidental intimacy, receded into routine. Ayla's work became an island she tended carefully, and Adrian's world contained more meetings, more legal briefs, more efforts to stitch the company's trust back together. They circled each other in the margins, their paths crossing like two comets that traced parallel arcs and never quite met. Once, by accident, Adrian arrived early to a morning briefing and found Ayla at the coffee station, her hands dwarfed by the industrial machine as she filled cups for colleagues. The room smelled of roasted beans and paper, ordinary and somehow comforting. He'd intended to give her a wave and pass, but she caught his eye. For a second there was recognition, something soft and human. He smiled. "Morning," he said, "because words are small bridges." She nodded, polite but distant. "Morning." He hesitated, then added, "Did you get a chance to look at any class catalogues?" "I can." "No," she interrupted, gentle but firm. "I'm busy at the moment." It was a harmless refusal, the kind of small, efficient thing that separates schedules. Yet the exchange vibrated with meaning. He felt the brush of a closure he couldn't explain. She was protecting herself, and he was being politely shut out. Another time, he saw her through the glass of the staff room window during a lunch break. She sat alone at a table, her lunch container open, her eyes on a page where she had scribbled something in neat, careful handwriting. He considered entering, imagined sitting opposite her and making the kind of idle conversation that builds trust. Instead he lingered on the other side of the glass and walked away. He told himself he respected her privacy. He told himself he wanted to avoid spectacle. But in the quiet place inside him where he kept private things, he named the truth. He missed the small and ordinary access he had once had, the ease of a shared cup and a moment unmeasured. Rumors never quite died. There were corporate mouths that shaped gossip into a useful defensive narrative. Some said he was flaunting a goodwill campaign, others insisted she had been bought into a program for optics. Neither version matched the slow, awkward resilience of their real exchange. The world liked stories with clean arcs, life preferred messy ellipses. Ayla felt the pressure in other ways. Some of her co-workers, women who had been friends in the undercurrent of night shifts, started to look at her differently. Their tone wavered between admiration and resentment, both of which made her uncomfortable. She tried to be present for them, to bring the same steady humor and quiet strength to their shared table, but there were moments when she would excuse herself early and walk the long route through the building's service corridors to avoid the speculation-filled staff room. Between the quiet acts of avoidance, there were also more tangible frictions. The company, wanting to be careful, placed restrictions that felt peculiarly isolating. She was offered a mentor to help arrange logistics for classes, but the mentor's calendar never matched her shift schedule. The tuition fund existed, but forms and processes turned the possibility into an administrative maze that required time she did not have. The more she tried to make progress, the more she encountered the delicate bureaucratic walls that separate intention from action. For Adrian, the distance was a lesson in humility. He began to understand how generosity can feel like a public performance to the recipient if not offered with deep care. He was careful to step back, to let Syra and the legal counsel handle logistics so Ayla would not feel compelled to accept help out of politeness. He also found moments when the world required him to stand up for the kind of dignity he believed she deserved, pushing for flexible hours, for confidentiality protections, for the company to not weaponize assistance into a PR stunt. Those were things he could do without crossing personal boundaries. They were the acts of a man trying to reconcile gratitude with pride, his own and hers. Distance, however, has its own gravity. The less they spoke, the easier it became for assumptions to fill the empty space between them. Each small silence allowed room for the past to calcify into a myth. She had saved him and then moved on, he had saved the company and then tried to buy kindness. Neither was true, and both felt in danger of becoming the public's preferred narrative. Yet distance also gave them both room to breathe and reflect. In the evenings Ayla opened her little leather notebook, wrote dates and small observations, and practiced sentences she wanted to say if she ever found the courage. She made lists of subjects she might study, business law, perhaps, or community development, and the page offered a quiet promise. Possibilities, unlike gossip, could be written down and tended. Adrian, alone in his office, revisited the night that had changed things. He replayed the moment when she had stood in the doorway and said, simply, "Please don't sign it." He felt the moral geometry of that instant like a guidepost. He began to think about the culture he wanted to foster, one in which people at every level felt safe to speak up. He drafted memos and oversaw new protocols, but he also wrote a note on his desk that read, "Listen more, presume less." He found himself saying it aloud sometimes, as if to train his tongue. The distance, then, was not only the absence of closeness, it was the presence of reflection. Both of them used it to weigh the terms of their choices. Both of them, despite the silence, cared in small, significant ways. He insisted the company continue to offer the educational fund without press fanfare. She quietly kept the notebook under the lining of her bag, a small sanctuary for dreams she would claim on her own timetable. There was an ache to the separation, a slow, patient sort of longing that did not demand dramatic gestures. It was in the way she could not help but look at him when he passed by, and in the way he kept a watchful eye on the corridors she frequented without making it obvious. It was in the small kindnesses that continued through proxies, Syra bringing extra tea, internal counsel adjusting schedules, the security guard offering a nod. In the slow days that followed, their lives began to exist like two parallel scripts, close enough to notice the other's presence, far enough apart to hide secrets. The building absorbed the hum of their silence and continued its steady work. People argued about signatories and ethics and shareholder statements. Files moved. Meetings convened. Life found its rhythm again. And yet under the hum, there was a current that never quite stopped, the memory of a woman who had interrupted a signature and a man who had listened. Their distance was not an end but a passage, a time for the edges of their personalities to be tested, for pride and gratitude and dignity to find their measures. Something else was forming in the quiet space between them, a cautious regard, patient and wary, waiting for the moment when one of them might step across the corridor and close the small, stubborn space that separated them. Maybe, Ayla thought, writing in the margins of her notebook, some distances are necessary to learn how to meet halfway. And somewhere he, too, was thinking that perhaps some bridges are better when built slowly, measured, with care, and not for public display. Rain turned the city into a watercolor of smudged light and hurried silhouettes. It fell steady and soft at first, then heavier, as if the sky itself had decided to wash the day clean. The lobby of the building steamed with the breath of umbrellas and slick coats. Taxi lights flashed like beacons, and people moved under their canopies as if attending a private ritual of avoidance. Ayla was finishing the night shift, her hands puckered from the hot water, the mop wrung clean and leaning against the janitor's closet like a small surrendered flag. She tucked her little leather notebook safely inside her bag, the pages damp at the edges from a previous coffee spill and from the small, private life of a woman who prized small things. The rain had come harder than she'd expected. Her scarf, the one with the frayed edge, was clutched around her throat but did little against the cold that soaked through to her bones. She kept her head down, the way workers do when they want to be efficient and invisible at once. The wet tiles echoed with her footsteps, the sound seemed larger in the late hour. Outside, the stream of umbrellas thinned and then concentrated into the beat of tires and the hiss of wipers. She wrapped her coat more tightly, shoulders hunched against the chill, and thought of home, a single-room apartment and the warmth of a shared blanket, the small certainty of her mother's presence. Adrian was leaving the office late, too, his tie loosened, shoes carrying the faint damp of city streets. He had been in the glass tower long enough to know the routes down from the high floors, stairs to the side service entrance, a shortcut that avoided the press of the main doors. He had meant to head straight to his car and out into the rain, but through the lobby windows he saw her, Ayla, hair damp around the scarf, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, the little leather notebook peeking from her bag like a secret. He hesitated, then moved toward the service exit because the sight of her there, small and soaked, lodged against the part of him that had been raw with gratitude since that first night. He had tried staying distant, had promised himself to respect her privacy, always Syra to arrange things, always counsel if help was needed, but in the moment he realized practical care needed no committee. She stepped off the curb, umbrella against her shoulder, as if to test its patience. A stream of taxis drove by, their windows fogged, faces uncertain. Her lips were set in the line of someone holding back small urgencies. Mr. Rowan. Her voice caught on the title because in the rain the air felt like another person who might witness impropriety. Adrian, he said, because he liked the name more and because formality felt too sharp in the rain. She offered a small, polite smile and tilted her umbrella against the wind. You shouldn't be out in this, she said. It came out as practical concern rather than command. You shouldn't be out in this either, he replied. He reached into his coat and shrugged a darker, heavier jacket off his arm, a plain, practical thing, not a statement. Would you like a ride? I'm going your direction. Her posture tightened at the offer as if she'd been handed a choice that would force an explanation she did not owe. It was the kind of moment that forced one person's humanity into another's domain, and the politics of gratitude rearranged themselves in the smallest gestures. No, she began, the reflexive refusal of pride. I have my bus pass. I'll be fine. He saw the lie in the way the fabric clung to her shoulders. He saw her fingers tremble as she adjusted the strap of her bag. The rain had soaked the hem of her coat, the scarf at her neck was damp and darkened. He saw the little tremor that went beyond cold. There were the bus tokens, the worry about extra costs, the way a rainy night can make a week's budget feel brittle. His voice softened. Come inside for a moment. At least let me get you a towel. The car's warm. You don't have to tell me your reasons. He said it as a statement, not a question. There was no patronizing tilt in it, only a practical insistence. Ayla held her ground like someone waiting at a gate. She had been careful all her life about accepting things that would change how people saw her. She had learned that favor often came with invisible receipts. But the world had already changed for her in small ways, a roof repaired, a notebook that smelled of new paper, the knowledge that a man with power could listen and act. Part of her wanted the quiet relief of a dry seat and hot tea, Part of her feared the ledger that might follow a ride home offered by a CEO. "I can't take you up on that," she said finally, voice low. "It's too much." Adrian looked at her then, not as the public might, with an appetite for scandal, but with a patience that refused to be bullied by pride or propriety. "It's not too much," he said. "It's just a ride. No strings. No press. And if you prefer, I'll wait in the car while you get dry. I won't come into your apartment, I'll wait until you're settled." There was a tenderness to the offer that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with decency. He had learned, painfully, that the smallest gestures could be weaponized into narratives. So he chose a smallness, a coat, a car, a warm seat. It was not a grand rescue. It was a way to make the night kinder. She looked at him for a long beat, the rain drawing lines across the street like ruled paper. Her fingers flexed around a strap. She thought of Zara and her mother, of the groceries that waited in the tiny kitchen, of the bus that would take longer and be colder. She thought of the way giving in might be misread later and of the private dignity she kept like a plant on a windowsill. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like surrender and relief braided together, she nodded once. "Thank you," she said, almost inaudible against the rain. He handed her his jacket and watched while she shrugged it on clumsily, the fabric a size too large but an immediate armor. The jacket smelled faintly of his cologne and of leather polish, strange and oddly comforting. He kept his hands away from the vulnerable task of pulling the sleeve as if to leave her with the independence of the movement. They walked to his car in a companionable silence that felt like a truce. He opened the back door and she settled into the seat with the care of someone who was learning a new habit. The car's heater exhaled a small, dry warmth that felt like an apology from the weather. The hum of the engine and the patter of rain on the roof created a private room between them. "Where to?" he asked, glancing at her. She gave him the address with a voice softened at the edges. It was a small, ordinary thing to say numbers and a street name. He started to drive and kept his eyes on the road but took in the way her shoulders relaxed, the tiny line of tension easing from her jaw. He resisted the urge to ask 1,000 things, about school, about the notes in her notebook, about her mother's roof repaired, but he couldn't keep from offering small comforts. He turned the radio to a quiet station and lowered the volume. "Do you want something to eat?" he asked, because someone who grew up with resources learns the grammar of practicality. She shook her head, eyes distant. "No, thank you. I'm okay." "But you were cold," he said. "Your hands were shaking." She blinked, surprised into vulnerability. There was a pause as if both of them were reconsidering what had become public property, emotion. Then she said softly, "I get cold sometimes." He looked at her hands in the lap, small, work-etched, and wanted, absurdly, to mend more than practical cold. He thought of the nights she had spent awake in his mind where mistrust had been a veil, and felt a sudden, fierce tenderness that had nothing to do with heroism and everything to do with simple human care. He stopped the car for a moment, at a red light, and said with the calm of someone who wanted to give, not command, "If you like, I can arrange for a small heater for your apartment. Nothing public. I'd have someone deliver it tomorrow morning. No announcement. Just heat." Ayla's expression loosened, part astonishment, part a small, reluctant gratitude. She thought of the little metal heater she'd borrowed from a neighbor in colder months and how it had been unreliable. The idea of warm nights without counting coins made her eyes shine. "That would be helpful," she said. "Thank you." They reached her stop. He waited as she fumbled with the door, checked the hem of her coat, and stepped into the rain again with his jacket pulled slightly around her. He walked her to the apartment steps under the thin glow of the street lamp and watched her hurry up, umbrella barely keeping the rain from her face. He did not follow her to the door. He had learned to respect thresholds. He watched until the building swallowed her silhouette and then walked back to his car in the rain that no longer felt like an adversary but like a witness as he drove away. The image of her, small and determined, the collar of his jacket high, stayed with him. He felt an ache that had the quality of guardianship without ownership. The ride had been small and practical, not theatrical. Yet it mattered to both of them in ways that would ripple, a coat that smelled faintly of another life, a heater to be waiting in the morning, and the knowledge that sometimes the first gesture is not meant to declare love but to say, plainly, you are not alone. There are lives folded in small places, pages pressed between the seams of ordinary days. Ayla's was one of those lives, a stack of quiet defeats and private ambitions that never made it into the office memos or the building's polished narratives. Adrian had seen only the present: mop, notebook, careful eyes, until the rain and the jacket and the heater softened a door he had not known existed. It happened in the way many truths do, accidentally, humanely. A vandalized bus stop, a slipping step, and a helping hand had led Ayla to a clinic appointment where the receptionist, a friend of Syra's, offered a cup of tea and an idle question about what she liked to read. Ayla, who kept her life measured and private, had a habit of sketching short lists in her notebook: groceries, bus tokens, a line or two of something she had read or wanted to read. On that day the list had included a title, a name that made the receptionist's eyes lift with soft surprise. "You know that book?" the receptionist had asked, incredulous. Ayla blinked. "I used to. In school." The receptionist called Syra with a laugh that suggested this was a fact worth passing along. Syra, who had been quietly managing Ayla's logistics and had become something between an ally and a professional friend, brought it up gently when she next sat with Adrian. "She mentioned literature," Syra said. "She referenced a poet in passing, and then she kept a list of authors." Adrian, who had a hunger for particulars now, small human things, the sort that did not appear on balance sheets, asked if they could show him the notebook. It was not prying, he told himself, it was curiosity. He wanted to see the interior life of the person who had halted a signature and then refused the limelight. Ayla's hand tightened around the leather when Syra politely suggested she might share some pages. There was a moment where the old instinct to retreat rose like a tide. Pride is a tender thing. It is not worn like armor so much as like a second skin. She had agreed, though, because Syra had said it could help with class placement and because Adrian had been gentle in the staff room. She opened the notebook slowly, the way one opens a letter that might contain unwelcome news. The first pages were practical lists: milk, a light bulb, a reminder to call Zara. Then, toward the back, the lines slanted into sentences that read like fragments of an interrupted life: finish essay on civic responsibility, due March. Scholarship application, attach recommendation. Father's letter, save for repairs. Some words were smudged with coffee, others bore the tight script of someone who had learned to economize ink and time. Adrian read with the polite focus of a man who had learned to value the small details. He found references to a school, an old city college, where Ayla had excelled in economics. There was a page with a list titled Thesis Ideas and underneath a note in a looping hand: Microcredit and Community Resilience. There were names, professors, mentors, written as if bookmarks: Dr. Hamid, Professor Layla. There was also a page with a faded prize certificate taped awkwardly into the margin: Top Student, Introduction to Economic Thought. The paper had yellowed slightly, edges soft. Ayla watched his face as if scanning his reaction would tell her what verdict he would carry out. He looked surprised, not because intelligence had been hidden from him, she had long suspected as much, but because the depth of what she'd set aside felt profound. It reconfigured her from an actor in the margins to someone who had deliberately paused an unfinished sentence. "You studied economics?" he asked quietly, the question itself a delicate thing, not the office curiosity of a man with resources but the sincere wonder of someone who had glimpsed landscape behind a window. "A little," Ayla said. Her voice held something like embarrassment and pride braided together. "Until I didn't. There was an illness. My father. We needed money. I took work wherever I could." She pinched the corner of the certificate, as if the paper's fragility mirrored the memory. "I thought I could study at night, but the hours at home were precarious. One thing led to another." Her story was not cinematic, it did not fit neatly into tragic tropes. It was the slow attrition of choices made under pressure: a mother's cough that led to hospital bills, a brother who needed a bus pass, a landlord with quiet impatience. Each decision felt like a small, inevitable erasure. She had not stopped learning because she lacked curiosity, she had stopped because survival demanded presence in different ways. Adrian listened. He had read about people forced to choose between ambition and care. He had not, until then, understood the arithmetic of those choices. The notebook lay between them like a map of a life paused mid-route. "Why didn't you come back?" he asked, not because he wanted to admonish but because there was an odd ache in his voice, an ache that had more to do with lost possibility than with pity. Ayla looked at the floor, the scar of the years showing in the set of her mouth. "Because when you leave a dream you don't always get it back," she said. "You take a detour." The detour becomes a road. The money you earn now feeds people who depend on you. That's not less important. There was a fierceness in her tone, defensive, sure, but also an invitation. See beyond the story of loss and into the world she had built that mattered. He felt ashamed, for his earlier assumption that her life had been simple, for the ease with which power had enabled options he'd taken for granted. He thought of the quiet things he had done unconsciously, scholarships funded, projects announced with small ribbon cuttings, gestures intended to amplify capacity but that had often felt institutional rather than personal. He wondered if, in his desire to help, he had erred on the side of spectacle instead of listening. "Would you want to finish?" he asked after a pause. The words were loaded, not with a presumption that he could fix the past, but with an honest offer to help with the logistics, tuition, materials, the bureaucracy that made access a daily negotiation. She exhaled a breath that might have been laughter or something like it. "There are nights when I miss the lectures," she admitted. "I miss arguing about policy with people who had different assumptions. I miss Professor Layla's questions that made you rethink a sentence." She looked at him then, and vulnerability flickered in her eyes. "But I also have responsibilities. I don't want to be a charity case, Adrian." "I know," he said quickly. "I don't want you to feel that way. I want to make it possible in the way you choose. Not to be saved, but to have the option." He watched her as if learning to measure how help could be offered without stealing agency. "If you prefer evening classes, I can arrange that. If you prefer a scholarship through a community fund so it looks less like a direct favor from me, we can do that. If you prefer nothing, I will respect it." She studied his face. For a moment she saw not the CEO whose signature shaped companies but a man trying to learn the grammar of respect. "There's a class that starts next month," she said slowly. "It's evening and it's on microfinance, small banks, community resilience. It's exactly what I used to write about." Her mouth curved in the ghost of a smile. "But I'd need to rearrange work. That's the rub." "Then let me help arrange the shifts," he said promptly. "No one will know. No press. Just practicality. We'll adjust the schedule so you can attend and get paid. It will be normal. You'll have to show me nothing but your presence." The offer hung between them, quiet and careful. Pride warred with possibility in Ayla's eyes. She had learned to be wary and to ask the question that always mattered: what price came with acceptance? "Why are you so determined?" she asked finally, not accusing but curious. "You could have let it go like most men with power." He met her gaze and felt the honest truth settle into his chest. "Because you reminded me how costly trust can be when abused," he said. "Because you refused to let something wrong happen. And because I'd like to see you write sentences you were forced to stop." She considered him, the way one considers whether a path leads into light or into shadow. Then she closed the notebook and tucked the certificate back into its fold with a tenderness that suggested she wasn't giving anything away so much as allowing a new page to be written. "All right," she said, the word a careful bridge. "Let's try." It was not a surrender. It was a measured acceptance, a mutual recalibration. For Adrian it meant a small, enduring commitment to do more than gesture. For Ayla it meant a cautious reopening of a door she had shut for reasons that made sense in the ledger of life. They stepped outside together into a late afternoon that smelled of rain-washed pavement. The air between them seemed different, less guarded, not unscarred but attentive. The hidden past had been revealed, not as a wound to be exploited but as a seam to be tended. In that revelation was the beginning of a new reckoning, one that would require patience, respect, and the humility to let learning be the product of a choice, not a transaction. In her notebook that evening, Ayla wrote, "Apply, microfinance evening course. Talk to Zara. Call Professor Layla." She drew a little box beside it and ticked it as if closing a small, important circle. The tick was not dramatic. It was quiet, it was hers. And somewhere in the glass tower, a man who signed contracts for a living folded a letter of introduction into an envelope with the same care any man does when he wants to offer something that honors autonomy rather than buys it. The first nights of class felt like stepping into a river after years of standing on the bank. Ayla arrived with her notebook, now filled with lists and tiny triumphs, and a quiet nervousness that she hid behind a practiced calm. The evening room smelled of chalk dust and cheap coffee. The students were a curious cross-section of ages, some young and hungry for careers, others older and returning to unfinished sentences. Professor Layla, grey at the temples and quick with a smile, asked the kind of questions that made people stumble and then think more clearly. Ayla loved it immediately and fumblingly. The jargon was familiar enough to soothe her, the debates addictive. Adrian did not attend the lectures, he had not meant to, but he found himself outside the college gates one evening, walking past the neon sign and watching the lighted windows. He kept his distance because he believed in the dignity of secrecy and because, despite everything, he was still learning what it meant to be involved without smothering. Seeing her through the glass, leaning forward, pen to paper, brows knit in concentration, felt like discovering a painting he'd never noticed in a hall he'd crossed 1,000 times. It taught him the small truth that people are often more luminous when they're doing the thing they were meant to do. Their conversations grew like a slow bloom, first practical, then honest. He arranged a shift change with Syra so Ayla could attend Tuesday evenings and paid for the modest materials she needed through a scholarship routed quietly through the company's community fund. No one name attached, no press release. He made sure the logistics were invisible because he had learned that dignity is often the casualty of generosity offered with fanfare. You've been here before, Professor Layla said in the third week, handing back a short paper. There's an economy in your sentences. Don't let it sleep. Ayla smiled and tucked the compliment like a coin into a pocket. She called Adrian once after a demanding seminar and laughed into the phone because she had found herself arguing a point and then delighting in having the vocabulary to defend it. He listened with a pride that was careful and warm, asking measured questions about her readings and offering, when asked, a recommendation from a director of a small fund who might help with materials. The exchange was small, and neither of them wanted it to be anything but. Outside of class, their interactions were a study in restraint and discovery. They began to learn each other's rhythms. He learned that she liked black tea steeped exactly 3 minutes and that she read best under lamplight. She learned that he put too much salt in his eggs and that he had a habit, when nervous, of tapping the rim of a mug 2 times before answering. They found delight in the ordinary details, the private facts that become intimacy without drama. There were awkward moments, of course. Office whispers, at first curious, hardened into speculation. A junior manager who had once nodded to Ayla in the elevator now trained his eyes away as if proximity were a scandal. Vivian, still removed from power but not from resentment, made occasional pointed remarks in meetings about distraction and unnecessary fraternization, thinly veiled in corporate parlance. Elliot, whose prominence had been eroded by the inquiry, watched with a suppressed blend of envy and contempt. These external currents forced both Ayla and Adrian to speak honestly about boundaries. We're not doing anything wrong, Ayla said one afternoon as they walked the glass corridor together, the sunlight warming the polished floor beneath their steps. But I don't want what I'm doing to become a story for someone else's use. I don't want that either, Adrian replied. I'll guard the logistics. You guard your stories. If at any point you feel exposed, we stop. No questions, no explanations needed. She looked at him then, measuring the sincerity in his face. Promise? She asked with a half-smile. Promise, he said, and it felt like a word both of them were learning to hold lightly and seriously at once. Their bond deepened in the small ways that mattered, a seat saved in the staff room when she had an exam, a packet of photocopied articles waiting on her desk about microfinance case studies, a text message sent at midday that read only, "You're doing well," and another that read, "Tea after your last lecture?" When she accepted the tea, it was not because she needed his approval but because warmth shared without pretense can be the simplest form of companionship. One rainy evening, after a long seminar on community savings groups, they walked together beneath the building's overhang. The rain threaded like a net through the city, forming small rivers along the curb. She was tired, the kind of bone-level fatigue that follows sustained effort, and he could see it in the slack of her shoulders. "You look like you could sleep on a bench and be content," he said, gently teasing, to which she replied with a dry laugh. "Maybe I would be content," she said, "if benches came with warm blankets." He stopped and pulled a small scarf from his bag, one he kept for emergencies, he said later with a grin, and offered it. The gesture was perfectly ordinary and oddly intimate. She accepted it, wrapping it around her neck as if sealing an agreement. Small kindnesses could be gifts, not currencies. As the weeks turned, there came a moment neither of them could name at first, the point at which mutual respect began to shade into something with a different gravity. It was not a sudden spark but an accumulation of being present for each other, showing up for lectures, picking up groceries when a storm delayed the market, proofreading an essay on an economic model at midnight. They began to confide in the small ways strangers rarely do. Ayla told him about her first job sweeping at a small bakery where the baker had taught her to read the yeast weather, and Adrian told her about a scholarship that had once changed his own trajectory, about a night he had stood on a rooftop and wondered what he owed the world besides money. Their differences, world views, experiences, the gulf of privilege, did not vanish. Instead, they became contours around which they learned to move. He learned to listen without offering solutions too quickly. She learned how to ask for help without shrinking from the complexity of it. The dynamics were messy and beautiful in equal measure. It was during a quiet weekend when the city was asleep and an unexpected storm knocked out power blocks away, that their closeness felt most like a natural truth. The building's emergency lights hummed as they both found themselves in the staff room, the cleaning crew gathered by candlelight, the office staff wrapped in sweaters. People talked and laughed and shared food in the small, necessary way communal hardships do. Adrian had come down on his own, not because he needed to be noticed but because the thought of that room lit only by candles and human voices felt right. He sat beside Ayla and they shared a packet of flatbread. She described a problem in a microcredit simulation, how to incentivize repayment without coercion, and he listened with the keen attention of a collaborator rather than a patron. Their voices wound around each other easily, referencing theories and human stories in the same breath. Someone nearby remarked on the odd pair, and the remark was nothing more than an observation. The room's warmth dissolved any stigma. After the lights came back, when fluorescent bulbs reasserted the businesslike order, they lingered a moment longer in the stairwell under the glow. The air smelled like wet cement and the quiet left in the aftermath of those small communal hours. "You've changed my routine," he said, half in wonder. "You've changed my options," she replied, and the sentence did not bristle with indebtedness but shimmered with opportunity. They laughed, because the truth of it was neither poetic nor transactional but as mundane as a shared cup. People tend to the people who tend to truth. Their growing bond was not announced with trumpets, it accreted like sediment, layer by layer, making the bedrock of something reliable. In the privacy of small gestures and shared study, they learned to balance gratitude and autonomy. They created a space where she could be both a leader in her classroom and a woman who mopped through the night, and where he could be a man who signed million-dollar checks and also carried someone's jacket through a storm. The city kept its pace, indifferent and relentless, but in the small alcoves of their lives a steady recognition was forming, one built on listening, respect, and the slow unclenching of two cautious hearts. There is a moment love often keeps to itself, a small, private concession that arrives without fireworks. For Ayla and Adrian it began as a soft shift in the cadence of their days, the way a text arrived earlier than necessary with a simple good luck today, the way a book was left anonymously on a desk with a note inside, for when you need a quiet read. It was not the sweeping drama of novels but the hush of two people learning to speak in a language of attention. Ayla noticed it first in the tiny way she watched for his silhouette in the glass hallway. She would not have called it yearning, the word felt too large and too theatrical for the careful life she led. It was more like a small weather, a warmth in the chest when a seat was saved for her at lunch, a steady, private approval that had nothing to do with applause. She surprised herself, too, at the soft ache when she imagined him across a room not as adversary or donor but as someone whose presence made certain hours easier to shoulder. Adrian felt it in the small, subversive ways he found himself rearranging his calendar. A meeting might be postponed because her exam ran late, a briefing might be shortened because he wanted, irrationally, to catch the end of a lecture she attended. He noticed that he catalogued her laughs like small rewards and that when she was absent from the staff room his day lost a thread of its color. He told himself it was gratitude, or a sense of obligation, or a refined paternalism. The truth was less tidy. It was something that began to lean toward affection without naming itself. They both resisted with the caution of people who had seen stories take the light and turn it into spectacle. Office politics was a predator of nuance, headlines loved a tidy narrative. So they kept their gestures private and their words careful. They had rules, implicit, fragile ones, to preserve dignity, no public declarations, no gifts with cameras, no shared flights home. They believed modesty would protect them from the sharp edges of rumor, and modesty became armor. Still, whispering things to the mind is not the same as living them aloud. There were evenings when Ayla's hands trembled with the strain of 3 shifts a week and the pressure of assignments, and he would show up in the building's mailroom, where Syra had convinced him to meet her once to hand over some photocopied articles, and hand her a paper with carefully circled passages. He would stand at the doorway and speak quietly about a sentence she had written, the cadence of the words, the way she argued nuance. They were small, scholarly intimacies, and they felt like a private language. But the world has a way of listening in. An offhand comment by a junior manager, a misread photo on social media, the prickle of office gossip, little things braided into a rumor that love was imbalanced here, a man of money entangled with a woman who cleaned floors. The whisper grew teeth and then legs. Ayla felt it most when an article appeared on a weekend forum with a headline that mingled praise with a tone of incredulity. CEO's new project, philanthropy or play. Someone had taken a photograph, no big thing, a candid shot of a man and a woman passing in a sunlit corridor, and miscaptioned it as a staged PR moment. The post spread. The comments were quick, judgmental. People love to draw straight lines across complex human arrangements, transaction, manipulation, heroism. They dislike ambiguity. She read the comments in the quiet of her kitchen. Zura hovered in the doorway, more protective than curious. Ignore it, Zura said, hands on hips. They're nothing but noise. Ayla felt the sting not because of the words themselves but because of the way they rearranged her standing in the world. She had worked for years to keep her life unremarkable by design, safety in invisibility. The idea that her presence might be turned into fodder, that her motives might be questioned, tightened her chest. Adrian watched the same thread of commentary from his office window, the glow of a laptop screen painting his face in blue. The vitriol surprised him not because he thought himself above reproach but because he had underestimated how easily small acts of kindness could be made weapons of narrative. He felt protective, not in a paternalistic way but in a human way that had less to do with title and more to do with stubborn care. He also felt an unfamiliar vulnerability, the idea that his choices could be judged by people who had never met Ayla or seen the way her hands moved through a classroom. They met that evening, not in the staff room but in a quiet park across the road where the city's hum dulled to an even, distant pulse. It was late and the air was cool, leaf-littered with the beginning of autumn. They sat on a bench under a street lamp, two small shadows facing each other as if poised on the edge of saying something that mattered. "You saw it," Ayla said, not accusing but acknowledging. Her voice was steady, the professional tone of someone who had weathered louder storms. "I did." He met her gaze. "I'm sorry you had to see that." "It's not just the article," she said. "It's everything. The looks. The way people say things like he's helping her climb up as if knowledge is currency that must be bought." She closed her hands in her lap. "I don't want to be someone's project." "You aren't," he said. His voice was gentle and entirely certain. "And I'll be the first to call out anyone who suggests you're anything else." She let out a breath that could have been a laugh or a sob. "You don't have to defend me to strangers," she said. "I can defend myself." "I know." He rubbed his palms together as if warming them. "I'm asking for the privilege of being the person who does it when you don't have the time. That's all." They sat in a silence that was not empty, but full of the small refusals and acceptances that build relationships. She looked at him, at the careful set of his mouth, at the kindness that arrived in functional packages, and something unguarded moved between them. "You make me nervous," she admitted, with a small, wry smile. "It's not you. It's the way people read our story." "And you make me braver," he replied, almost too softly. "Not because you ask me to be. Because you show me what it means to be accountable with my power." The words, simple, honest, were a kind of confession that neither had planned. The lamp above them hummed like a witness, and the bench held their quiet. They were not ready to name it aloud. It felt premature, as if naming something too early would strip it of its texture and force it to fit into a frame that neither wanted. So they whispered instead, half confessions, half promises. He promised to keep their interactions as she wished. She promised to tell him when she felt exposed. They promised, with small, human vows, to guard the dignity of what they were building. In the following weeks the whisper of love did what most quiet things do. It doubled back into everyday life and made the ordinary more luminous. She corrected his minor misreading of an article and he returned the favor by transcribing an interview she wanted to analyze. He sent her a copy of a lecture recording when she missed a class because of overtime. She started leaving little notes, encouragements hidden among the photocopies of exhibits. Each note was modest, a line of appreciation for a thought, an essay, a courage that had nothing to do with their titles. There were tests, of course. A senior director began to lobby for narrative control, insisting the company produce a human interest piece that would, as he put it, shape the message. He argued that a story of CEO and cleaning lady would humanize the brand. The boardroom debate that followed was clinical, but the subtext was raw. Would they exploit privacy for warm press? Adrian listened and said, deliberately, that if any story were told it would be told with consent and with dignity, and that consent could be withdrawn at any time. It was a small stand, but it was a line he would not cross. Love, in its best shape, respects the other's edges. It does not press boundaries in the name of passion, it widens them. For Ayla and Adrian, the whisper of love grew as a series of tiny refusals to let outside hands script their story. They refused to be used as an emblem. They refused to have their names attached to a narrative that did not belong to them. It was, in many ways, a quieter victory than anyone could have anticipated. They never published a joint photo. They declined staged interviews. Instead they built a private archive of kindness, corrected drafts, spare lectures, quiet gestures. In a world that liked extremes, they chose the patient accumulation of small acts. One evening, months after the first rumor, Ayla received a text. No public declaration, just an image, a small sketch of a bridge, with a single line beneath it that read, "We're building this slowly." She smiled, a small, private smile reserved for the safe things. She typed back 3 words that felt both decisive and tender, "Let's keep building." They were not yet lovers in the dramatic sense. They were closer than they had been, and the whisper had turned from a possibility into an ongoing present. The world would continue to whisper and shout, people would find angles and Monet's narratives. But in the quiet spaces they had carved, classrooms, staff rooms, late-night walks, something steady took hold, a respect that could become love, and a love that, when it came, would be measured in the quiet ways it honored the other's dignity. The company's annual charity gala was the sort of night that asked even the most modest people to walk for a while in shoes that felt borrowed. Crystal chandeliers threw small constellations across tuxedos and gowns, waiters threaded through conversations with trays of something inedible and perfect, donors posed with practiced smiles. The press were present in discreet clusters, their cameras like small, hungry moons catching every polished angle. Adrian had not planned to stay long. The gala supported a scholarship fund he'd helped seed years ago. His presence was expected and routine. But the evening had an odd gravity. Old donors returned, new benefactors leaned across tables as if negotiating futures with napkins. He moved through the room with the habitual grace of someone for whom social choreography was almost accidental. A brief speech, a few handshakes, a private word with a director who had proposed a new community program. Ayla had not been invited. She had politely declined when Syra offered the option. They'd both known the optics would be terrible, and had spent the night instead at Professor Layla's office, preparing for a project presentation. The distance felt healthy. It kept their lives separate in the ways that mattered. She liked it like that. Around 10, a photograph hit her phone. It was a simple image in a seafood pink overlay. Adrian, laughing at something a woman in a sequin dress had said, his arm casually around her waist. The caption was small but sharp. CEO cozy with socialite, new romance? It had the gloss of gossip and the velocity of a rumor. The comments under it were immediate, brutish. Of course he'd pick her. Old money meets new face. She's married to the art dealer, right? Ayla stared at the photo until the pixels blurred into a smear. The laughter in the picture looked like complicity. The hand at the woman's waist looked intimate. Context, where he was, who the woman was, the truth of whether the arm had ever tightened or been a casual rest, mattered less than the roaring hunger for a neat story. People wanted edges, and the image supplied them. Adrian, across town, had been smiling because the woman, Sophia Hale, a well-known patron and, as it turned out, Vivian's cousin, had been telling him a story about a community arts project that unexpectedly dovetailed with the company's outreach. He'd put his hand on her back in a reflexive, friendly way as he leaned in to hear better. A colleague snapped a picture at that exact second. In the world of photographs, warmth can be a betrayal. He didn't notice the picture for an hour. When the first private message arrived, "Did you see this?" he felt the brief, cold drop of dread. He opened the post, the angles of the room shifting into accusation. He texted Syra, "Is this real?" She called back within minutes, voice tight. "It's everywhere," she said. "We can control it, if we act fast." They acted fast. The company released a brief statement that evening. The woman in the photograph was introduced to Adrian as a potential collaborator for the arts initiative. The contact had been strictly professional. A photo from earlier in the night, Adrian with the scholarship recipients, his arm around a lanky 15-year-old, was posted to counter the narrative. Spin was a practice thing. Statements were polished. But counter-narratives rarely erase the immediate cut of an image in 1,000 minds. The post continued to accumulate commentary. A TV morning show ran the photo with a snide voiceover. Vivian's old allies suggested the story proved Adrian's soft spot for theatrics. Elliot, who still nursed bruised pride, let his sources feed a whispered question about judgment. Ayla read the company's statement and scrolled back up to the original photo. She tried to force the lens of truth onto it. The knowledge that the woman might be a patron did not settle the unease. In the cropped image, intimacy read like intention. It fit the simplest, cruelest narrative, a powerful man moving too quickly, a woman stepping into a story he would one day regret. Her chest hardened. All the little promises between them, the private texts, the careful boundaries, suddenly felt vulnerable to public redefinition. She imagined how Syra must scramble and how he must stand by a podium clarifying things. But she also imagined the private world they'd been building, the notebooks, the quiet lectures, the heater by her window, pulled into a headline that would relabel generosity as pretense. She put the phone down and tried to keep going. In the classroom the next evening, her hands moved on autopilot, her mind a tangle of imagined explanations and the slow burn of hurt. Professor Layla handed back graded projects, caught her eye, and offered a look of quiet concern that made her throat tight. She excused herself to the restroom and leaned against the cool tile, breathing until the room stopped its skittering. Why had he not called? Why had he not, without a breath, sent a text explaining the context? She knew the practical reasons he might have been delayed, schedules and press, but in the hour after the image went viral, she had expected him to do the small human thing, a note saying it's not what it seems. The lack of it had a weight she had not prepared for. When she finally texted him, "Are you okay?" the reply was delayed, measured, saw it. "Please, can we talk tomorrow?" He apologized in the message, not defensively but careful, hinting that the truth was complicated and that he would explain. The delay felt like distance wearing a new coat. It felt like a polite refusal to make a private explanation public. It felt, to her, like avoidance. The next day, the office air was charged. Questions muttered in hallways, the cafeteria hummed with speculation, and Vivian's relatives floated like pale presences in the margins. Rumors braided with truth until they were hard to separate. Ayla moved through the building with a practiced calm that wore thin with each passing hour. Her friends asked, "Did he call? Is he okay?" Her answers were laconic. Her pride insisted she not be the person who looked to a man for explanation. Her heart, however, wanted the small reassurance of clarity. Pride is often a shield that needs occasional lifting. The misunderstanding grew teeth when a colleague, an intern she trusted, mentioned, with the clumsy earnestness of someone trying to help, that he'd seen Adrian later in the evening speaking privately with Sophia Hale in a quieter room near the gallery. "Not like that," he said quickly when he saw the flare in her eyes, but the seed had been planted. The image, the late replies, the rumors, together they built an architecture that made space for suspicion. Ayla found herself watching him in the corridors with a new and painful attention. When he passed with his usual composed nod, she felt the sting of an unasked question. She wanted to ask, was that intimacy, or were we just a moment in the frame? But she also wanted to preserve the small dignity of her own life and the agency she had fought to protect. Adrian, for his part, moved through the day as if the air around him had thickened. He answered press calls with the dry competence of someone trying to contain a narrative. He met with counsel to see what the company could do to dampen the rumor's reach. He texted Syra and asked about legal counsel. Yet in private, he felt the familiar, private ache of someone who had hurt another inadvertently. He imagined her at the lecture hall, fingers on page, brow furrowed, feeling the world pull a mislabel over the tableau they had been building together. He had thought the company's statement would be enough to steady the ship. He had underestimated how an image could slice. That evening, after the day had slowed to that peculiar corporate lull before people went home to their curated lives, Adrian found her in the staff room, the place where laughter and cigarette breaks and honesty lived in tight quarters. She was alone, a sandwich half eaten, eyes on a page but not reading. He sat across from her without preamble. For a moment neither spoke. The room hummed with small radio static and the distant echo of keys. He could see the brief, foolish pain in her face, the way she kept part of herself behind the line of her jaw. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words small and absolute. "I should have called sooner." "The photos," Sophia was talking about the gallery project. I put a hand on her back because of the noise and I leaned in to hear. "It looks worse than it was." She folded her sandwich wrapper with quiet deliberation. "It looks intimate," she said, not angry but flat, like a verdict delivered matter-of-factly. "You were photographed with your arm around her waist." "I know." He rubbed his forehead, helpless in that way that is not weakness but the recognition that explanation cannot always undo an image. "I was trying to be attentive. I didn't anticipate the photo. I should have reached you sooner. I wanted to." He stopped, searching for the right shape to make the apology. "You wanted to what?" she asked, voice thin. "Tell you the truth without making a spectacle," he said. "I wanted to explain in private. I still do." Her mouth curved, not in amusement but in the tired geometry of someone who had been frayed by waiting. "You had the chance," she said. "You had lots of chances to send a line. A word. A call. Instead I watched people rewrite what we had." He was not defensive. He felt the culpability of an absent message and the awkwardness of a man who thought he was honoring privacy but who had neglected the immediate human need for clarity. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "I'll tell you everything. I will wait while you listen." She looked down at her hands, at the small work-etched knuckles, and then up at him. For a moment the past and the present collided, the night in the staircase, the notebook, the classes, the small acts of care. Was this what it had come to, an image, a rumor, an hour of silence? The thought stung. "Not now," she said finally, quiet and uncertain. "I need time. I can't keep rearranging myself to fit into a headline." He nodded, ache in his throat like a stone. "Take all the time you need." She stood and left the room without a backward glance. The door closed like a book. He watched her go and felt the strange, immediate sense of loss that names itself in small things. Missed chances, the weight of an UN-sent message, a photograph taken in an instant that could redraw the map of two people who had been trying, gently, to map themselves to each other. Outside, the city continued to trade in images and angles. Inside, two people who cared for one another stood at the edges of a misunderstanding, watching as rumor built a wall neither of them had intended. The ache, soft, stubborn, and urgent, waited for resolution, but the night offered only the long, quiet work of rebuilding trust once it had been shaken. Silence is not simply the absence of words, it has its own shape, a topology of small avoidances and careful routines. For Ayla and Adrian, the silence that followed the photograph was not a neat pause but a widening zone where every glance felt like a decision and every corridor became a place of negotiation. Ayla kept to the routes she'd always taken, but the routes now felt surveilled. She arrived earlier to avoid eyes at the elevators and lingered later to let traffic thin. When colleagues asked after her classes she answered with brief, neutral phrases, "They're fine, I'm managing," the kind of replies that protect more than they explain. At night she read under the lamp in her small room, the notebook on her knees, and felt the tug of anger and hurt and the dull ache of betrayal. It wasn't that Adrian had done something dramatic, it was that he had not moved fast enough to close a fissure the world had pried open. The omission had been a small stone that rolled and dislodged other things. In the office, the whispers continued their slow metabolism into narrative. Some people were kinder than gossip, some people were crueler. Vivienne watched from the margin with an old predator's patience, sensing opportunity in a wounded friendship. Elliot tested waters for narratives of professionalism and impropriety. The company's PR arm tried to tamp down the flames with careful statements, but statements could not reach the soft interior where trust had been bruised. Adrian felt the silence like a missing limb. He respected her need for space, he had said as much, but respect sometimes becomes an excuse for inaction. He had imagined that a quiet explanation, given with care, would suffice. He had misread the velocity of a rumor. In private, he replayed the timeline, the gala, the photograph, the delayed text. He blamed himself for 100 small failings, the assumption that absence equals respect, the bureaucratic reflex that delayed a quick, human reply. So he did what he knew how to do. He acted where his actions were least visible. He instructed Syra to make sure Ayla's shifts were manageable, to provide quiet transport when rain threatened, to ensure the heater in her apartment was functioning. He authorized small, anonymous scholarship disbursements to cover extra course materials. He tightened media safeguards around personal information and reminded the legal team to advise reporters that any contact with staff would be through official channels only. None of those were enough. They were protections, necessary, practical, but they could not cross the thin line into the simplicity of a direct apology. He wanted to speak to her with words that did not litigate the image but simply said, "I see you, and I am sorry." He wanted to stand in front of her and offer the small, awkward admission that he had failed to prioritize her need for immediacy. But every time he rehearsed the sentence, he found himself measuring its implications. Would a direct approach be seen as pressure? Would it unsettle the fragile equilibrium she had carved out for herself? Ayla's days filled with the tiny gratifications of learning, a question tackled in class, a paragraph that finally shaped itself the way she'd intended, a conversation with Professor Layla that left her buzzing. Those were her bright points. But between them there were long stretches where she felt raw, a glance that landed the wrong way, a stray comment overheard at the copier, a notification on her phone that she dared not open. One afternoon, during a break between seminars, Professor Layla took her aside. They sat by the window that overlooked the college courtyard, where students wandered like nervous birds. Layla's voice was low and careful. "You look guarded," she said, not as a reproach but as an assessment. "Learning is not just about lectures, Ayla. It's about being allowed to fail and to try. It sounds like you've been doing a lot of the second without the first." Ayla looked at the professor. The old woman's eyes were kind in a way that did not demand anything. For a long moment Ayla considered telling her everything, the photograph, the silence, the ache. Instead she said, "I don't want to be someone else's headline." Layla nodded. "You don't have to be. But you also don't have to disappear. Courage has many faces. Sometimes standing still is courage. Sometimes leaving is." The sentence sat between them with the weight of permission. That permission unsettled Ayla. Standing still felt like endurance, leaving felt like reclaiming agency. Over the next week she began to withdraw in a different register, not simply avoiding Adrian, but considering what her life looked like without him in it. She balanced paychecks and rent notices in her head and saw that her needs could be met in ways that did not require someone else to be her weather. The idea settled like a slow, surprising relief. At the same time, pressure mounted from outside. A freelance journalist who'd smelled a story tried to contact her for an inside take. The editor of a weekend magazine suggested an exclusive that would set the record straight and paint a narrative of resilience. The offers were gilded traps: pay them, tell them your truth, and watch how truth becomes a product. Ayla refused politely and then more strictly. She liked the notion of truth on her own terms. Adrian respected her refusals but felt the sting in the way she pulled away. He had once believed that the right systems could be the scaffolding of dignity. Now he was learning that scaffolding without presence could feel like a construction site rather than a support. He began to leave small, carefully anonymous things at her desk, a book on collaborative economics with a note that read simply, "For when you want to remember why you began." Syra took care to deliver the items in a way that wouldn't draw attention. Ayla discovered the book and set it aside, grateful but guarded. She told herself to be practical. Notes could be helpful. Anonymous gifts need not be read as more than kindness. Still, the silence between them grew. It was not only the refusal of speech, it was the accumulation of small nothings: a missed coffee, a text unanswered, a corridor passed without recognition. People who pass through a life make marks, and absences make their own marks too. One afternoon, exhausted from both study and the slow erosion of privacy, Ayla retreated to the small courtyard outside her building to write. The page had become her sanctuary. Sentences were islands where she could anchor herself. She opened her notebook and began to write a letter, not to the press, not to friends, but to herself. The lines were a reckoning: what she wanted for work, for study, for dignity. She wrote until the pen blurred with ink and the sky shifted toward evening. When she finished, she read the letter through and felt a fierce sense of control. She underlined one sentence and folded the page carefully. The sentence read, "If my presence here becomes a story that costs me my quiet work, then I will choose the quiet. It was not a surrender. It was a condition. She considered the ways to enact that condition. Resignation was a blunt instrument. She did not take it lightly, but it felt, in that instant, like a declaration of agency. If the company could not shield her from being reshaped by rumor, she might leave on her own terms and keep the life she had built intact. The idea had a distinct logic to it: leave before being pushed, step away with the dignity of choice. That night she sat at her small table and drafted a letter of resignation. Her handwriting was steady. She wrote with care, thanking the company for the opportunities and noting that she hoped the institution would continue to protect its workers. She folded the page and slipped it into a plain envelope, the kind used for internal memos. She did not address it yet. Writing the letter had been a test. The act made something tangible that until then had been an ache. Adrian, in his high office with the city spread beneath him like a map, opened an email from Syra and learned that Ayla had been quieter than usual and had not come to the usual Wednesday study circle. He felt the familiar, heavy prick of worry and the sharper edge of urgency. He authorized Syra to call her and, when she did not answer, to check in at her apartment. The thought of losing her, whether to resignation, to retreat, to distance, had a new urgency that made him more direct than he had allowed himself to be in days. But for all his action, he understood that some things could not be hurried. The silence between them needed tending, yes, but not at the cost of agency. He would have to choose: press forward and risk making her feel cornered, or wait and risk losing her to the very quiet she sought. The dilemma was a small, human ache. That night Ayla slid the envelope she had written into the drawer of her table. She did not yet drop it into the internal mail. She did not yet sign the line that would end her employment. Instead she left it like a bookmark in her life, a measure of the decision she might take. The silence between them remained, not resolved but held, a liminal space where choices would be made in the slow, careful language of two people who had once altered the arc of a room with a single voice. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, two lives, intersecting, then retreating, rested in the hush that follows a rumor. The quiet was heavy and full of possibility. It might bury them, it might teach them to listen differently. Either way, the silence had become its own character in the story, one that would demand either a gentle bridge or a decisive crossing. Ayla had never been a woman of dramatic gestures. Her life, until now, had been built of small certainties: the exact way to wring a mop, the arc of a sweep that chased dust into a neat heap, the rhythm of bus schedules memorized like hymns. But the gossip, the photograph, the slow ache of silence had carved a new urgency into her ribs, an insistence that sometimes the only way to keep a life intact was to decide its terms. She woke early that morning with the letter like a stone at the back of her throat. The sentence she had underlined the week before: "If my presence here becomes a story that costs me my quiet work, then I will choose the quiet," felt less like surrender and more like boundary. She moved through the small ritual of her morning in a kind of reverent haste. The kettle hummed, the spoon clinked against the cup, and she wrote the date at the top of the page as if it were the first line of a new, hard truth. The letter was not an indictment. She could not bear the thought of burning bridges for the sake of a headline. She wrote with the economy she used in her lists, the same steady script that had once tracked assignment deadlines and rent due dates. She thanked the company, because gratitude was not something she would throw away even in anger. She thanked Adrian, not for saving a signature, not for charity, but for the chance to return to a classroom, for the small, practical ways he had altered the logistics of her life. She expressed, plainly and without flourish, that recent events had made her re-evaluate the cost of visibility and that she preferred to step away rather than be remade into someone else's story. She read the paragraph, then another, and with each line the letter settled into the shape of a decision that felt wholly hers. There was no flourish of blame. There was no plea. There was the quiet dignity of a woman who had thought about what she would keep and what she would release. When she folded the page and slid it into an envelope, her hand trembled only once. She tucked the envelope under her coat as she left the apartment and walked to work by the long, winding back streets she'd always preferred, routes that kept her below the cadence of public eyes. In the day-early light the city looked kinder, as if misunderstanding could be softened by weather. She rehearsed the small acts that would make a resignation gentle: the tidy handover, the note to Syra explaining the timing, the removal of her personal items tucked away in the small drawer of the cart. She did not intend to make the resignation a private sermon. She wanted, instead, one last act of clarity. By the time she reached the building, she was composed. Her mop's wheels squeaked their familiar rhythm, belying the flutter of her heart. Syra greeted her in the staff room with the practiced care of someone who had learned to be both a buffer and an ally. "Everything okay?" Syra asked, a radial of genuine concern in her voice. Ayla smiled, small and careful. "Fine. Just a long night." She tucked the envelope deeper into the pocket of her jacket. The weight of it felt honest. All morning she moved through her tasks as if nothing had changed, the bathrooms, the corridors, the slow polishing of metal handles. She kept an eye on the executive floor, not because she expected reaction but because the possibility of leaving seemed more present the closer she came to the man who had been at the center of her private storm. The building wore a different light, each reflection on glass seemed to hold a question. During the lunch hour, with the offices briefly emptied and the hum of air conditioning turning into a low sleep, she wheeled her cart toward Adrian's suite. She had considered slipping the letter through internal mail or leaving it in Syra's hands. But those felt like sentences handed over to other people's punctuation. If she was leaving, she wanted the act to be direct, an honest closing that would not invite interpretation. The executive floor smelled of lemon cleaner and a faint trace of expensive cologne. The receptionist looked up as she entered but said nothing. Syra had already informed a few people that Ayla would be in the area. The security guard at the desk nodded with the economy of routine. Ayla walked to the door of Adrian's office where the polished brass nameplate glinted and placed her hand on the knob as if on a boundary. The office was quieter than she expected. The afternoon sun fell in a band across the carpet. The leather chair behind the desk was pushed in as if expecting someone to return. She set her cart just outside the door and took a breath that steadied the small tremor of leaving. She did not want theatrics. She did not want to stand and speak and leave a trail of dramatic words. Instead, she walked up to the desk and placed the envelope on its surface, where it would be caught by the light, a small white in a room of dark wood. She smoothed it with the back of her hand, an unceremonious gesture that felt enough. Her name was not on the envelope. The flap had been tucked dry and honest. She did not leave marks. Her signature would be on the resignation once processed, she had decided, but leaving a plain envelope felt like the clearest possible statement. The contents belonged to the recipient's discretion. For a moment, as she stood with her hand resting near the edge of the desk, she let herself remember the first night, the mop abandoned at the landing, the business card in her pocket, the way a man had looked at her as if he'd found a truth. She felt gratitude folded into sorrow. Her choices had created both rescue and exposure, and both had cost her something. She straightened, smoothed the crease of her uniform, and turned toward the door. Syra met her at the threshold with the soft, unreadable face of someone who had seen both victories and retreats. "If you want to talk," Syra began. "No," Ayla said gently. "Not here. Not now." She offered Syra the briefest of smiles that contained all the things she could not say: thanks, caution, love of the quiet. She pushed her cart away with steady hands and walked down the corridor that had once felt like a river, a place of movement, and now felt like a map of choices. She did not rush. She walked slowly, as if gathering the small pieces of a life she would carry forward, the little leather notebook under her arm, the pocketed mittens, the weight of a decision made in private. The building's staff room hummed behind her, the small universe of people who worked at night and held the city's cleanliness in their hands, where laughter and cigarette breaks and shared food would continue regardless of what a headline said. Outside, the air was cool and the sun had a clean, blunt light. She walked through the lobby without looking back. She did not cross the street to watch the office windows or glance at the executive floor. That would have been curiosity with an unfinished end. She preferred departure to watching the mechanics of consequence. Upstairs, behind the closed door, the envelope sat on Adrian's desk like a quiet fact. For all the procedural layers he'd surrounded himself with, legal briefings, PR statements, counsel, there remained a point of contact that no committee could entirely mediate, a single page written in the hand of a woman who had once stopped a signature and had now opted for silence. The day wore on. Meetings came and went, and the office hummed in its habitual tempo. People had no immediate reason to open the envelope. It was a small, private thing, and small things often waited. Ayla finished her shift with the same precise motions she'd long practiced. She stacked the rags, topped up the cleaning supplies, and counted the petty cash with a care that made the numbers buckled into her palm like small truths. She left the building the way she always had, through the service door, into the back alleys where the city's noise softened. On the walk home she did not think of outcomes. She thought of the lines she had underlined in her notebook, of Zera's laugh that afternoon, of her mother's easy cooking. She felt, underneath the ache, the clarity of a choice that had been claimed. The letter was now out of her hands. That felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. In the evening, Adrian's assistant made a note of the envelope when she straightened the desk for an end-of-day tidy. She picked up the plain paper, turned it over, and saw Ayla's handwriting on the corner of the flap. Her breath caught in a soft, surprised sound. Then she slid the envelope into Adrian's briefcase, thinking it prudent to let him open it privately. When he finally opened the briefcase in the quiet of his office, later, after calls and counsel, the envelope unfurled like a small, deliberate tide. He recognized the handwriting even before he read. He felt a hollow, then an iron bloom of something like fear and the immediate, precise prick of responsibility. The letter was short and careful. The lines unfolded like the map she had written, gratitude, explanation, and the news, clear and calm, that she was resigning. He read it twice. The first time he read it like a man surveying a damaged plan. The second time he read it like a man learning the true cost of his silence. He set the paper down on his desk and touched the spot where her hand had smoothed the envelope. For a long moment he sat very still, the city stretching out below him, indifferent and vast. Then he reached for the phone, but paused, because a phone call might arrive as pressure. He reached for his notebook instead and wrote 2 words with a hand that trembled only slightly: find her. Outside, Ayla crossed the small bridge near her apartment, a gentle figure with a life she had chosen to keep quiet. She did not know he would look for her. She had simply made a choice to leave what felt unbearable behind and to keep the life she had built on her own terms. The letter had been left behind. The ripple it would create had not yet reached its shore. When Adrian folded the letter back into his hand, the desk lamp made a small island of light on the wood. The city outside was a scatter of indifferent stars. Inside the office, everything narrowed into the weight of the paper and the knowledge that a single omission, an unsent message, a delayed call, had changed the course of someone's life. He did not pause to think strategy. The word find her on his notepad felt less like an order and more like an ache. He pushed his chair back so abruptly the casters squeaked, and he was already calling Syra before the full shape of what he wanted to do had formed. When she answered, he kept his voice steady but urgent. "Have you seen Ayla today?" he asked. No pretense of procedure, only the directness of a man who suddenly cared about one particular presence. Syra's pause was the length of someone who had been bringing order to chaos for days. "She left this morning as usual," she said. "She was scheduled for the evening class tonight, Professor Layla's seminar. I emailed her earlier to confirm transport and she didn't reply." "Is she at the college now?" he asked. Syra promised to call the university immediately. She moved faster than he expected, a professional set in motion by a personal concern. Within 10 minutes she was on the phone with Professor Layla, whose voice, when it came through on speaker, was softer than the legal memos Adrian had read that morning. Layla explained that Ayla had not attended today's session. She had sent a warm message earlier in the week about a scheduling conflict. She'd assumed Ayla was adjusting shifts as discussed. Layla's concern was evident in the small clause of her sentences: "She's dedicated. Please make sure she's all right." Adrian felt the public apparatus of the company fold into a private operation. He authorized a security check at Ayla's apartment but instructed Syra to keep it discreet: no sirens, no cameras at the door. He did not want to deepen her sense of exposure. The security team called back that the apartment door had been answered by Zera, who explained she'd spoken with Ayla that morning. Ayla had said she would come by later to pick up a package from the grocer. Zera hadn't seen her since. The list of last knowns shrank into a handful of people who loved her for practical reasons: Zera, her mother, Professor Layla. Adrian reached out to each, carefully, apologetically. Zera's voice snapped with a coppery concern. "She said something about stepping away," Zera told him. "She was upset about the article. She said she'd think about leaving if it cost her the quiet." Adrian felt the ground shift. He thanked Zera and asked her where Ayla might go if she wanted to be alone. Zera's answer was not poetic: "There's a rooftop near my building, she likes to go there to think. By the old water tower. You'll find her if she's there." He hurried out without stopping for the plastered routine of office guards or PR statements. The car he took was a small, unobtrusive sedan. He wanted none of the appointed motorcade that would make her feel stalked. On the drive, his mind ran through the ledger of what he should have done. Early calls, a short message, anything to diffuse the rumor. Guilt, sharp and precise, accompanied him like a second passenger. The rooftop Zara had named was a cluster of low buildings in Ayla's neighborhood, the kind of place where laundry fluttered like pennants and where you could hear a radio station from 2 blocks away. He climbed the stairwell 2 at a time, each landing a measure of distance he had to cross both physically and in the ledger of human error. The rooftop was empty except for a single figure seated on the low parapet, knees drawn to her chest, the city spread beneath her like an indifferent map. She wore his jacket, his coat, folded around her shoulders. The sight of it pinned him in a way nothing else could, the way the fabric pulled, the smallness of her outline against the sky. He stopped a few meters away and did not speak at first. There was a propriety to that silence, a respect born of guilt and fear. She did not look up. The rain from earlier had left the air clean and the building sharp. Pigeons hopped on the water tower. For a long moment she said nothing, and he let the silence hold him accountable. Finally, in a voice that was neither theatrical nor strained, he said, "Ayla." She inhaled slowly and then turned. Her face was worn in the manner of someone who had done too much thinking in one sitting. The wind teased loose a strand of scarf. Her eyes were steady, not angry exactly, but guarded in a way that made him ache. "You found me," she said. The sentence had no wonder in it, only the fact of recognition. He closed the distance and sat beside her on the parapet, careful not to crowd her. "I started looking the moment I read your letter," he said. "I am so sorry. For not calling. For not being faster. For letting the story become something that might cost you your work. That was my failure." She listened. Her jaw worked like someone forming a calculus. He could see the counting. "It cost me," she said bluntly. "Not because it was big, but because people like big stories. They'll reframe anything that moves them. I don't want to be moved, I want to be steady." "You're right," he said. "And I was so busy respecting your privacy that I thought silence was the protection you needed. I misread it. I thought I was doing the right thing by not broadcasting. I see now how that looks, as absence." He swallowed. "I should have done both, kept things private and sent you a note. I should have been immediate." She looked at his palm, then at the city. "It isn't just the missed call," she said. "It's the slow wearing away. When people make you a story, you become public property. Little kindnesses can feel like strings." He nodded. "I don't want to be part of strings. I want to be part of choices. If you want to resign, I respect it. I won't force you to stay. But please, let me make this right however you want." The bluntness of the offer made silence grow between them again. He had not demanded forgiveness, he had given her the awful sovereignty to hurt him. That was the shape of contrition, to be willing to be made smaller so the other person might feel whole. She drew her knees closer. "Why should I believe this is about choice and not convenience?" she asked, not unkindly. "If you can press buttons to protect me, why should I trust that you won't press other buttons later to shape my life?" He admitted, with a slow, honest shake of his head, that he could not give guarantees against the machinery that came with his position. "But I can give you one thing I won't manipulate, my capacity to step back. If you want the scholarship split through another fund, anonymized, I will do it. If you want no contact, I will make it so. If you want a public clarification in your name first, we will get you whatever platform you choose." He let the suggestions fall like coins on the parapet, not as transactions but as options. She considered the list as she considered the city, pragmatic and wary. "You always make it sound like a menu," she said. "But life isn't ordered plates." He smiled despite the ache. "Then tell me what the first thing is," he said. "What do you need right now so that staying or leaving is your decision and not something you feel pushed into?" She thought a long time. The rooftop was a small island in which truth sounded clearer. "I need one honest thing," she said at last. "Say, on paper, that you won't contact the press or use my story for any corporate campaign. Put it somewhere official that I can check. Otherwise the rumor will keep being a blade." He blinked, surprised by the specificity. "I can do that," he said without hesitation. "I'll sign it, legal, HR, everything. No stories. No use of your image. And I'll ask the board to formalize it. That will be written. That will be real." She let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "And then," he said, "I will wait to hear whether you want to rescind the resignation. If you don't, I will respect it and help with references and ensure you have the quiet you need to finish the semester without being harassed. If you do want to stay, only on terms you set, we make that happen too." Ayla's eyes glistened under the street lamp's distant glow. The map of her choices had just shifted, no guarantees, but a written covenant and a willingness to accept her decision. That was respect mediated by bureaucracy, perhaps, but meaningful to someone who had learned the arithmetic of small things. She tucked her chin into the collar of his jacket and let a small, private smile touch her mouth. It was not forgiveness entirely, not yet. It was a reopening of a door she had sealed. The rooftop felt colder and somehow kinder. "Write it," she said softly. "Then we will see." He reached for his phone and, with deliberate care, sent a terse instruction to his legal counsel and HR. Draft a non-disclosure and non-exploitation agreement specifically protecting Ayla's image and story, dated and signed. He sent the message to Syra as well, arrange for her to sign only if she agrees. No press contact until she says otherwise. Then he slid his phone into his pocket and looked at her. "Will that be enough?" he asked. She made no promises. "It will be a start," she said. They sat together, not pressing the moment into declarations, but allowing the small, practical work of a contract to become the beginning of repair. The rooftop held their silence like a witness that did not judge. Below them the city moved, rumors would keep trying to find edges, but on that parapet, two people who had been reshaped by consequence began, carefully, to rebuild something that might, with patience, become steadier. The little cafe on the corner was the sort of place where the music never quite matched the hour. Slow jazz in the mornings, a vaguely upbeat playlist by afternoon. It smelled of roasted beans and buttered toast and the comforting, slightly bitter warmth of people who made space for themselves in small rooms. Ayla worked there sometimes on weekends, an extra shift to make rent, a soft place to be among the regulars, where faces were familiar and orders were the same week after week. It was an ordinary refuge, which was precisely why she chose it when the world outside felt loud. He found her wiping down a table by the window, sleeves rolled, the tiny leather notebook tucked beneath the counter where she kept her tips at the end of the shift. The bell over the door chimed like a polite interruption. Adrian stood at the threshold for a moment, watching the bend of her shoulders and the careful economy of her motions. It would have been easy, and perhaps wiser, to slip in, sit at a corner table, and wait for a quiet conversation. Instead, something in him moved faster than prudence. He crossed the floor and stopped at the counter. Her eyes lifted, brief surprise, the guarded calm, but before she could shape a greeting he drew a breath that refused containment. "Ayla," he said, voice steady but raw in a way he had not yet permitted himself to be. She straightened, one hand still on the cloth. The cafe's midday lull made the moment feel larger. A few patrons glanced up, then returned to their cups. He could have asked for privacy. He could have asked if they might speak later. But the bubble of rumor had been wound tight for too long. He had learned, with an ache, that private apologies sometimes needed public certainty to be believed. "I need to say something," he told her, and the sentence landed like a small, deliberate hammer. "Not for headlines or to heal anyone's curiosity. For me. For you. For the truth." She folded her hands, the cloth between her fingers now an anchor. "I told you I needed time," she said softly. "I know." He stepped a hair closer. "And I waited because I thought waiting was respect. I was wrong." His eyes met hers, open and unshielded. "I thought my silence would protect you. It didn't. It left you alone in a rumor. You deserve better than that." For a heartbeat she expected what came next to be a reiteration of promises already made, legal covenants, formal protections. He took a single step back and shook his head. "This isn't about legal promises anymore," he said. "I signed them because you asked me to, and I will never use your story. But a paper is only a paper if people know you aren't being used. I shouldn't have let you feel the need to leave. I shouldn't have let an image or a headline be the architecture of our truth." The cafe hushed in the way cafes do when something human happens. The coffee grinder's thrum softened, cups paused mid-sip. A woman at the next table put down her book and watched like someone witnessing a small confessional. Adrian's voice changed then, lower, unadorned. I came here because I don't want to be the man who loves civility more than the person he cares about. So this is me. Plain. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded paper, an old-fashioned, immediate thing, a receipt, a scrap, nothing performative. He didn't offer it. He looked at her instead. Ayla, I care about you. Not because of the story you happen to be in. Not because of the debt of gratitude that began in a corridor. Because I see you. I've watched you in class, arguing with fierce intelligence. I've watched you make lists and learn, even when life asked you to bend. I've watched you repair things with your hands and your words. He swallowed, choosing the lane of bluntness. I love you. I don't have a prettier way to say it. The room felt tilted, like someone had set a new axis. Conversation around them slowed as people folded the moment inward. He didn't demand anything. He simply spoke the simple, dangerous truth. Ayla's breath did not leave in a single sigh. It came in a small staccato of disbelief, hurt, and a wild, unexpected flutter. The ledger of their past weeks, boardroom decisions, ruined optics, contracts, the rooftop covenant, shimmered in her mind. Love had not been something either of them had planned on the timeline of corporate logic. But feeling it spelled new complications, power dynamics, public perception, the risk of endings that were not of her choosing. You're saying this here, she said finally, voice quiet, measured. In front of people. He nodded. Because I couldn't risk another moment where my silence is mistaken for anything but selfishness. I won't hide it from the world if it scares you, I will hide it if you ask me to. But I also can't pretend I don't feel it. I don't want to be the man who uses boundaries as excuses to remain distant. I want to be honest. She studied his face, the tired angles, the small lines that laughter had scored, the way he watched her as if cataloguing what was true. She thought of the nights she had written in her notebook, the way she had ticked a box about applying for classes, the heater that warmed her apartment, the rooftop where they had signed the covenant with bureaucracy and agreed on terms. She had, more than once, measured her heart with caution.